The great oaken doors of Hampton Court creaked open, as the dawn light poured across the polished stone floors, and the palace was already alive with whispers, footsteps, and the rustle of silk as servants hurried about. For the life of a Tudor courtier was measured not in coin or in food, but in closeness, and no closeness was more coveted than that which was permitted in the shadow of the royal bed, the heart of the monarch's chamber, where power, intimacy, and ritual all converged in ways that seemed both strange and sacred to those who had never walked the long galleries of the king's house. And yet to the men and women who dwelt within those walls, it was the rhythm of survival, the very air they breathed. Because in the world of the Tudors, the bedroom was not simply a place of rest, but a stage upon which ambitions were nurtured and fortunes destroyed. The bedchamber, contrary to the simple word that might suggest privacy, was in fact the most political of spaces, a theatre where the sovereigness, rising and resting, were not merely personal acts, but ceremonies of state. And to be admitted into that sphere was to be lifted above countless others. For those who dressed the king in the morning, or stood guard as he knelt in prayer, or carried a candle in the evening procession, were not simply servants but the watchers of a ritual that bound the body of the monarch to the body of the realm. For the king's flesh was seen as sacred, his presence infused with authority, and proximity to that flesh bestowed influence like incense from an altar, lingering and sweet yet heavy with consequence. Imagine the quiet just before the great door opened at dawn, when courtiers who had risen before the first bell gathered in anxious silence, their faces washed in candlelight, their hearts pounding with the knowledge that the moment was near when the ritual of the lever would begin. For the king's rising was not a solitary act, but a performance carried out in stages, attended by layers of privilege, so that some might only enter after the monarch was already seated in his chair, while others, greater in favor, were present even as the bed curtains were drawn back. And the highest, those rare few who were bound to the royal person, might lift the linen, hand the shirt, or lace the doublet, each gesture not merely service, but a ladder rung upon which ambition climbed. The privilege of the bedchamber then was no idle courtesy, but the golden key to advancement, for decisions were made not in the echoing council halls where speeches rang out, but in the quiet moments when the king yawned or sighed or murmured half-thoughts to those who waited on him. And to hear such words was to possess knowledge, and knowledge was power, for in the Tudor court, secrets were coined of the highest value, and those who slept closest to the king's door often awoke richer in opportunity than those who spent their days drafting proclamations or poring over state papers in distant offices. It was said, in hushed tones among lesser men, that one could trace the king's favor by noting who carried the royal nightshirt to the laundress, or who received the empty basin after the king washed his hands. And while to an outsider such tasks might appear humble or even humiliating, within the world of Hampton Court or Whitehall, these small gestures were golden threads woven into the tapestry of hierarchy for the Tudor monarch. Whether Henry with his great girth and dangerous temper, or Edward with his boyish frailty, or Elizabeth with her wary cunning, knew that the body was the axis upon which the kingdom turned, and thus the rituals of dressing and undressing, of lying down and rising up, became acts of governance as much as pageantry. And so it was that young Thomas, a newly appointed gentleman of the Privy Chamber, stood in the cool stone corridor that first morning, his palms damp against the folds of his sleeves, his breath caught between dread and delight, for he had been chosen to assist at the lever. And though he had long dreamed of stepping within the sanctum of the king's chamber, he now felt the weight of eyes upon him, the judgment of older men who knew that one stumble, one clumsy hand or ill-timed word, might end his career before it began. Yet one perfect gesture might set him upon the path to riches beyond imagining. For such was the peril and promise of the royal bedroom. The door swung wide, the herald called, and Thomas followed the procession into the chamber where the heavy curtains of the royal bed were drawn apart by pages revealing the monarch, not as a distant figure upon the throne, but as a man rising from sleep, his hair tousled, his breath slow with dreams not yet banished, and the courtiers bowed as though entering a chapel. For here was the true heart of sovereignty, and Thomas, though trembling, felt the enormity of the privilege settle upon him, a mantle both heavy and bright, and as he stepped forward to hand the king his linen, He knew that his life had crossed a threshold, for in this chamber within reach of the sovereign's hand, the world itself seemed to pivot. And while the courtiers moved about, adjusting cushions, fetching water, arranging the garments with practiced grace, Thomas thought he saw in the king's half-smile and drowsy glance the secret truth that few beyond these walls would ever comprehend, that the body of the monarch, vulnerable in its waking and its resting, was the body of England itself, and that those who guarded it, clothed it, and watched over it in its most private hours were not merely attendants but custodians of the realm's destiny, for the royal bedroom was both sanctuary and battleground, a place where the future of kingdoms might be whispered in the dark or sealed with the drawing of curtains. And thus began Thomas's journey, a tale not only of his own rising fortunes but of the strange, intimate politics of Tudor courts, where the bed was throne and altar alike, and where the privileges of the bedroom revealed the hidden heart of power. And so, as the evening bells of Whitehall tolled in their measured rhythm, carrying with them the faint reminder that even kings and courtiers must eventually rest the newly arrived young servant, Thomas found himself swept deeper into the labyrinth of expectations that surrounded the royal household. For while he had heard whispers of bedroom privileges of those honored few, who might hold the candle as the king retired, or who might be allowed to fasten the royal bed curtains, he had never realized until this night how those duties were wrapped in layers of ceremony and secrecy that turned a simple act into a matter of power and favor. For the very heart of the Tudor court was not the battlefield or the council chamber, but the bedchamber itself, a place where politics slipped beneath the covers of intimacy, and where alliances were tested by who was allowed close enough to touch the very sheets upon which a monarch dreamed. The king's gentlemen of the privy chamber, a select circle whose titles promised both service and surveillance, understood better than most that their position at the king's bedside was not mere proximity to flesh and blood, but rather an entryway into the kingdom's pulse, for when they held his nightgown or knelt at his boots, they could murmur soft words, plant seeds of influence, or listen to the mutterings of a tired sovereign whose guard was lowered. And Thomas, as he followed the older attendants into the candlelit corridors that led toward Henry's private apartments, realized with a mixture of awe and dread that he was stepping into a world where the shuffle of a servant's foot or the rustle of bed curtains could determine the fate of nobles and the rise or fall of families, because the king's body was not his alone but the living symbol of England, and access to that body was the most coveted privilege in all of Christendom. The routine of the bedchamber followed a script as rigid as any mass at the chapel, for first came the ritual of disrobing, a task never left to common servants, but bestowed as honor upon knights and gentlemen of lineage, who would carry away each garment with silent reverence, as if the king's doublet were relics from some saint. And then came the washing of hands, the prayers whispered as he laid aside the cares of day, and finally the gentle lowering of tapestries and curtains, all performed under the gaze of courtiers who knew that to linger too long or to show the slightest irreverence could mean exile from the court. For though it seemed a private act, every movement was shadowed by competition, every breath watched by eyes hungry for the smallest advantage, and Thomas, clutching the linen towel he had been ordered to carry, felt his hands tremble with the weight of unspoken rules, realizing that a stumble in this chamber was not forgiven as in the kitchens or stables, but remembered, retold, and weaponized in the endless gossips, but remembered, retold, and well plued and well told. Plost and web cyclists through how we plost through web plos low we were plus through we plesali war plis so sao we will we and poke can bima put and bad but pull with a lot with a off will on top with what part on off it off so with work before God go life after with the back that and will Bapa could go, but we're not got for the book, go both folk and spend home for some guess that's in its ass up that below often to a buffer to the Yet there was another layer of truth spoken only in riddles and whispers among the older attendants, who leaned close in the flickering glow of rushlights. For bedroom privilege was not solely about who watched the king retire, but also about who might confirm his vigor, his ability to sire heirs, his very masculinity in a world where a monarch's strength was bound to his bloodline. And so when Henry took a new bride, or when doubts gnawed at the legitimacy of his unions, it was these chosen men who became witnesses, those who listened for the sounds of consummation or stood outside the chamber doors with ears attuned, and sometimes even carried forth the sheets themselves as proof of fertility. And Thomas, hearing these tales as they wound through the corridors, realized with a shock that intimacy in the Tudor court was a matter not of hearts but of dynasties, a spectacle where even the most sacred acts of man and wife became theatre for power, leaving him both horrified and fascinated at the thought that he now belonged to this strange company whose duty was to guard not only the king's slumber but also his secrets. In the quiet that followed when the candles had been snuffed and the chamber secured, Thomas lingered in the antechamber with the others, the heavy silence broken only by the crackle of logs on the hearth. And it was then that he first heard the low murmurs of rivalry, older men reminding each other of who had been permitted to carry the basin that evening, or whose hand had touched the bed curtains. And he understood that this constant measuring of proximity was no trivial vanity, but the very mechanism by which influence was tallied. For a gentleman who held the king's slipper one night might whisper in his ear about a petition the next, and thus policy was born not in Parliament but in the soft darkness of the bedchamber, where whispers carried farther than proclamations, and the fate of nations might turn upon a candle set down at just the right moment. And Thomas, feeling the weight of that truth settle upon him, vowed silently that he would learn these rituals, for his future at court depended not on sword or speech but on how faithfully he carried a towel into the king's private room. And so, as Thomas Stafford settled deeper into his new duties, the corridors of Whitehall began to whisper in ways he had never heard before. For it was in the small hours of the night, when torches flickered low and tapestries trembled with the draughts of hidden passageways, that he realized the king's bedroom was less a place of rest and more a chamber of silent politics, a place where rivalries played themselves out under the cloak of intimacy, and where a soft knock on the door could decide not only who would dress the monarch in his morning hose, but who would be banished in disgrace before the cock crowed. It was in these hushed hours that Thomas first understood the weight of the ritual called the King's Rising. For though the ritual appeared to be nothing more than the king's attendants helping his majesty into linen, doublet, and cloak, in truth it was a carefully staged theatre in which every bow, every passing of a garment, every whispered word was weighed like coin, and those permitted to hold the royal nightshirt or slip the jeweled ring upon his finger were considered so close to the sovereign that their voices echoed through the council chamber, long before their words were ever spoken. Thomas remembered vividly the first morning he was summoned, when the groom of the stool post, so ridiculed in rumor, and yet so powerful in fact, beckoned him with a finger, and as he stepped across the threshold into the chamber hung with scarlet damask, he saw the king sitting upon a carved oaken chair, bare-chested, his pale skin glowing in the candlelight, while three great lords stood by, as though waiting their turn in an unseen contest, each eager to hand the king his boots, as though this small act would bind him to their cause. And in that moment, Thomas realized that privilege was not in the garment, but in the act of service, for service meant access, and access meant influence. Yet the bedroom was not always a place of silent maneuvers, for there were nights when merriment spilled beyond the gilded bedposts and the king's laughter rang through the timbers. Nights' laughter rang through the timbers, when musicians played lutes and viols while favorites lay sprawled upon cushions and whispered secrets that they would regret come morning. And it was during one such night, while the king drowsed half-dressed upon the bed after a banquet of swan and hip, that Thomas overheard Lord Audley tell the Earl of Surrey that those who watched the king sleep knew more of his fears than those who read his proclamations. For in slumber the monarch revealed his truest self, and the one who attended his night terrors could wield more sway than the boldest of courtiers at council. This notion haunted Thomas, for in the days that followed he noticed how men competed not only for daylight duties but for the hushed task of watching over the king at night. sitting quietly by the bed while the monarch tossed and muttered. And when morning came, it was these watchers who spoke with strange authority, for they could say, "The king dreamed of storms upon the sea," or "His Majesty cried out the name of an Anne." Such words would ripple through Whitehall like pebbles cast in a pond, shifting alliances, stirring rumors, reshaping the fragile balance of who was favored and who was forgotten. The more Thomas observed, the more he saw how the bedroom was not merely a private space, but the true heart of Tudor politics, a theatre where men wagered their futures on the intimacy of service. And he began to feel the pull of that stage himself, for each time he held the king's sleeve, each time he knelt to fasten a buckle, he felt the eyes of rivals burning into him, measuring him, judging whether this new servant might one day whisper a word that would tilt the fate of England itself. And so the days blurred into nights, and the rituals of the bedchamber became as natural to Thomas as breathing. Yet beneath it all, he could feel a slow, dangerous current pulling him deeper into a world where loyalty was both demanded and tested, where the king's sighs and mutterings in sleep could topple ministers, and where Thomas Stafford, once a nameless courtier, now found himself walking upon a tightrope woven of velvet secrets and shadows. The corridors of Hampton Court seemed to breathe with their own kind of memory as young Edmund adjusted the bundle of parchments in his hands, the flicker of torchlights chasing shadows across the patterned walls, and as he passed beneath the great tapestries that hung heavy with woven scenes of battle and myth, he could not help but imagine that the stern faces of long-dead kings stared down at him with the same curious suspicion as the courtiers who whispered whenever the king and queen passed. For in this palace nothing was ever entirely silent. Every step on the polished stone floors seemed to echo with a secret, every laugh that broke from behind velvet curtains seemed to mask another story, and Edmund realized that even the air itself carried rumors like a hidden music. Only the bold dared to follow. It was in such a corridor between the privy lodgings and the galleries lined with portraits of Tudors in all their finery that he first overheard the phrase that would haunt him for weeks to come, for two older gentlemen of the chamber, their cloaks brushing the tapestries as they walked, spoke in low tones of the royal privilege of the bedchamber, and while Edmund strained to appear as though he noticed nothing, the words burned in his mind like fire branded on wax, making him wonder what kind of privilege such as this could be, and why it was whispered with both awe and amusement, as though it were a jest too dangerous to laugh at. For the Tudors had made a spectacle of privacy itself, turning the most intimate spaces of the monarch's life into stages of ritual, where rising from bed became a performance attended by nobles desperate for favor, and where the act of retiring at night was witnessed by those whose duty was to prove that the royal body, the very body upon which the legitimacy of the dynasty depended, was whole and untainted. And Edmund, young as he was, began to sense that the court's obsession with the royal bedroom was not merely about comfort or luxury, but about power, visibility, and the theatre of monarchy. One evening, when summoned to deliver papers to a clerk in the presence chamber, Edmund lingered near the carved screen that separated the more public space from the guarded intimacy beyond, and from where he stood he could glimpse the pageantry of the Queen's retirement, ladies-in-waiting gathering like swans around their mistress, each with a specific duty, some to untie ribbons, others to hand the linen shifts embroidered with gold thread. And in that orchestrated ceremony, Edmund saw how the smallest gesture could become a ladder to influence. For the lady who handed the Queen her night robe stood closer than others, basking in a proximity that whispered of trust, while the rest curtsied and withdrew, their faces masks of both duty and envy. It was through these glimpses that Edmund began piecing together the unspoken truth that to be admitted to the royal bedroom was not to enter a sanctuary of sleep, but to step into the most coveted theatre of Tudor politics, where intimacy was currency and access was power, and where the privilege to attend the king or queen in their most private moments could mean the rise or ruin of an entire family. For favor could be won by holding a basin for the monarch to wash, or by folding the sheets after their rest acts. So humble in appearance, yet so weighted with meaning that men and women fought for them as though they were jewels. And as he walked back to his modest lodging near the kitchens that night, the corridors now dark and hushed, save for the faint hiss of torches Burning low, Edmund wondered how a court could so carefully blur the line between sacred duty and spectacle, how the very act of lying in bed could be transformed into a ritual of surveillance and trust, and he could not shake the thought that within those guarded chambers lay the heart of the Tudor enigma itself. For what seemed private was never truly private, and what appeared sacred was always shadowed by ambition. The candlelight flickered against the cold stone walls of Hampton Court Palace, where Thomas, the young attendant, who had grown accustomed to hearing secrets whispered in the twilight, began to notice that the so-called bedroom privileges of the Tudor court were not always privileges at all. For while nobles and courtiers might speak grandly of access to the king's private chambers, the reality was that such access meant living in constant vigilance, always waiting for the sound of footsteps, the call of a royal page, or the sudden turning of fortune that could see favor granted or stripped away in a heartbeat. And so he often reflected on how strange it was that intimacy with the king, whether by sight or by service, was measured not in affection but in proximity to power, with the entire court watching each step a man or woman took across the threshold of the royal bedchamber. It was during one such morning, when the great doors to Henry VIII's privy chamber were flung open to admit only those of the most trusted ranks, that Thomas observed how nobles craned their necks and whispered among themselves, each one eager for their moment, because being present when the king rose from bed or when he dressed was an honor greater than almost any title, though the act itself was deeply ordinary, for it involved servants handing fine stockings, heavy gowns, or fur-lined cloaks. Yet to watch this was to signal to the rest of the court that one was counted among the chosen. That one belonged in the circle where influence was whispered and decisions were born, and this made Thomas wonder whether the bedroom was less about sleep and more about stagecraft, a theater where the most powerful drama of Tudor England played out each morning and night. At times the intimacy extended even further, for he learned that certain nobles were permitted to share the king's bedchamber not for slumber but for closeness, as if sleeping near the monarch's presence could keep loyalty warm. Yet Thomas knew that those who lay too close risked both envy and suspicion, for enemies in the court could always whisper that such intimacy suggested secret counsel or dangerous ambitions. And so while courtiers might smile at the honor of carrying the royal nightshirt or standing guard as Henry dozed, each smile carried the weight of fear that tomorrow the same intimacy could become their undoing. It was not only Henry, though, whose bedchamber privileges mattered, for Thomas soon came to realize that the Queen's rooms held equal fascination, particularly when Anne Boleyn was mistress of the court, because where the king's chamber signaled authority, hers symbolized influence of another kind, a place where alliances were knit together with soft words, gentle laughter, and the closeness of ladies-in-waiting who were tasked not only with companionship but also with guarding secrets. For the Queen's body was as much a matter of politics as her crown, and so her bedchamber became the most scrutinized room in England, a space where the line between private intimacy and public scrutiny dissolved like wax in the flame of the chamber-esque candles. In such moments Thomas could hear the rustling of silk gowns through the corridor and imagine the guarded conversations that happened as the Queen prepared for rest, her ladies whispering of alliances, of fears, of who had caught the king's eye at the last feast, and of what it might mean for an if Henry's affections began to drift. And it struck him then that the very act of putting the Queen to bed, tucking her in, and drawing the curtains around her four-poster was more than an act of service. It was an affirmation that she still held her place, that she was still wife and queen, and that the court must continue to orbit around her presence as it did the king's. And Thomas wondered how such intimate rituals, usually hidden in the lives of ordinary people, became public theater for monarchs whose beds were never truly their own. The young attendant also began to notice the heavy air of suspicion that clung to these rituals, for he had heard stories, whispered among older servants, that even the act of who slept closest to the king could be used as evidence in trials, that accusations of treason or adultery could find their roots in something as simple as who was allowed inside the bedchamber after midnight, and he shuddered when he thought of how a privilege so coveted could transform in an instant into a burden that crushed a man beneath the weight of royal suspicion. and he began to sense that in Tudor England the bed was less a place of comfort and more a throne of shadows, where favor was granted and withdrawn with the twitch of a curtain or the closing of a latch. Yet Thomas could not deny the fascination, for when he stood in the quiet corridors late at night, holding a candle while shadows stretched long across the floor, he sometimes imagined himself at the edge of history, watching as kings and queens performed their most vulnerable moments in plain sight, each gesture carefully noted, each sigh remembered, and he realized that he was not alone in this thought, for all of Tudor England was obsessed with these private rituals, with the way the king rose, the way the queen retired, the way their beds were warmed by servants before they lay down, and the way every step between bed and chamber door was accounted for, so that nothing escaped the notice of a court that found its greatest dramas not on the battlefield, but within the folds of a royal bedchamber curtain. As months passed, Thomas began to see patterns emerge, how the nobles who gained the most from these privileges were the ones who understood the subtle language of the bedchamber, how a small bow when the king stirred, or a gentle hand when the queen lifted her gown for the night, could secure favor that would ripple outward into lands, titles, and influence, and he marveled at how the fate of kingdoms could rest upon such delicate acts, until he realized that to truly understand Tudor power, one must first understand its beds, for they were the stage where loyalty, ambition, intimacy, and betrayal all lay entwined, as inseparable as sheets after a restless night. And so Thomas, though merely an attendant, began to write in his private journal, noting down these moments in careful script, because he sensed that someday, long after his candle had burned out, and the courts of Henry and Anne were dust, the world would still wish to know what royal bedroom privileges were really about, and he hoped that by recording the truth as he saw it, the uneasy blend of intimacy and power, of privilege and peril, future generations might understand that the bedchamber of a Tudor monarch was not a place of rest, but the very heart of a kingdom beating quietly behind closed doors. The king's private apartments were at once splendid and suffocating, for while the golden draperies and the polished oaken panels gleamed under the torchlight, the air was heavy with the constant hum of whispers, as courtiers and ladies moved like shadows at the edges of the chamber, each one cautious not to disturb the king, yet eager to gather scraps of favor or gossip that might secure their place in the precarious order of things. At the heart of these apartments was the privy chamber, a sanctum guarded not by spearmen but by trust and discretion, where the king's most intimate companions shared dice, music, and secrets, and it was here that the so-called bedroom privileges reached their most delicate purpose, for only those deemed utterly loyal could cross the threshold at night when the monarch's vulnerability was greatest. These privileges were not only about serving the king's body, helping him undress, handing him his nightshirt, or keeping vigil while he slept. They were about access, for whoever attended the royal body at its most defenseless moments could whisper advice unchallenged, slip petitions into the king's hand, or earn a smile that might outweigh the carefully staged pleas of the entire council. Thomas Cranmer, once a quiet scholar, learned this truth when he found himself summoned late one night to deliver a theological book, and upon entering the dim chamber saw not only the king reclining but also his rivals seated close, their eyes gleaming as if daring him to speak the wrong word, and in that moment he understood that knowledge of scripture was less potent than the ability to read the shifting expressions on the king's weary face. It was in these twilight hours, when the tapestries muffled the world outside and only the crackle of the fire and the breath of the king broke the silence, that alliances were sealed and destroyed, for one misplaced jest, one careless sigh, could brand a man untrustworthy, while a well-timed word of comfort might elevate him to the king's confidant by morning. Yet the privilege of entering the royal bedchamber also meant exposure to danger, for the intimacy of the king's habits could easily be turned against the attendant. A rival might whisper that the king had groaned in his sleep like an ill man, or that he had confided a weakness, and suddenly what was once an honor became the seed of a charge of treason. Lady Rochford, who had once been a mistress of gossip in Queen Anne's household, later confided to a friend that the sound of a monarch's snore or the glimpse of his nightcap could wield more influence than sermons or statutes, because it proved one had stood closer to him than the rest of the court combined. So the bedroom, that most private of places, was paradoxically the most political, and the courtiers who hovered there became both guardians and potential betrayers, for the king's breath was their lifeline and his silence their undoing. And in the dark, as shadows danced on the carved bedposts, the courtiers themselves wondered whether they were keeping watch over the king or whether in truth it was he who slept with eyes half open, testing their loyalty even in slumber. The candlelight flickered against the carved oak paneling of the Queen's privy chamber as Lady Margaret leaned closer to Eleanor and whispered with the thrill of someone revealing a secret that ought not to be spoken, reminding her that the bedroom of a Tudor monarch was not simply a place of rest or intimacy, but a theatre in which the greatest dramas of ambition and downfall played out. For the privilege of being admitted to the bedchamber was so fiercely guarded and so jealously sought that entire families rose or fell, depending on who was allowed to watch the king put on his nightshirt, or who was called to witness the Queen's lying in after childbirth. Eleanor listened, heart thrumming, as Margaret explained that in Henry VIII's court the bed was never a solitary sanctuary, but a stage upon which the illusion of majesty was maintained, with even the most private moments transformed into ritual, for when the king rose each morning the gentlemen of the bedchamber would attend, presenting him with linen, handing him his doublet, buckling his shoes, and all of it was meant to reinforce not only their loyalty, but the spectacle of his royal body as a symbol of the realm itself, so that even the sight of his bare leg as he sat to pull on his hose became a reminder of their dependence upon his favor. It was a strange thought to Eleanor, raised in a quieter house where privacy was respected, to imagine that a king's most secret hours were constantly observed, and yet Margaret assured her that this was the essence of Tudor monarchy. For the body of the sovereign was considered semi-sacred, a physical vessel of divine right, and to serve that body in its most vulnerable state was to draw nearer to power than any courtier who merely debated policy or signed decrees. The two young women glanced across the chamber as the Queen's attendants prepared the room for the evening, folding back the sheets of the great bed with its towering canopy of cloth of estate, and Eleanor realized that this very bed draped in crimson, velvet embroidered with the Tudor rose, was more than furniture. It was a throne disguised as a place of sleep for those admitted to stand nearby at night were rewarded with whispers, confidences, and fleeting glimpses into the sovereign's mind, advantages that could tilt the balance of factions across the realm. Margaret recounted how, only a few years before, the rise of Thomas Cromwell had been hastened not merely by his cleverness in matters of state but by his ability to arrange who entered and exited the king's private spaces. For control of the chamber door was tantamount to control of England, and the courtiers who lingered beyond the threshold, desperate for admittance, understood that a moment by the king's bedside could yield more influence than months of petitions. Eleanor asked in a hushed voice if the king or queen did not find it humiliating to be constantly watched, but Margaret laughed softly and shook her head, explaining that to the Tudors there was nothing humiliating in it, because they believed their every gesture carried the weight of royal symbolism, and to have their bodies dressed or undressed before select witnesses was not shameful, but rather an enactment of authority, a daily reminder that even the most human acts of rest and rising were touched by majesty. The murmur of footsteps in the gallery outside grew louder, and Eleanor stiffened as the chamberlain entered to announce that the queen would soon retire, and with that simple declaration the entire room shifted into ceremony. Attendants, moving like clockwork to prepare basins of warm water, linen cloths and trays of sweetmeats for the queen's journey to bed, was as choreographed as a court masque, with every lady in waiting knowing her part. Eleanor stood near the wall, her heart filled with wonder, as she realized she was witnessing not the intimacy of a woman preparing for rest, but a carefully staged ritual that spoke to the very heart of Tudor culture, where power was never confined to council chambers, but breathed in the very air of the bedroom, where curtains of velvet concealed not privacy but politics, and where to stand even at the edge of that ritual was to step into history itself. The pale autumn light crept slowly across the high windows of Hampton Court Palace, the morning chill drifting through the cracks as the courtiers stirred, and among them Thomas carefully rose from his narrow bed in the servants' quarters, his head still filled with the echoes of last night's whispers about the king's movements and the uneasy silence that had fallen when mention was made of the Queen's chambers. For in that silence Thomas had felt the heavy weight of knowledge that the king's bedroom was never only a private refuge, but a political stage where the rituals of rising and lying down were scripted with the same precision as the ceremonies of Parliament. He walked through the long gallery, his eyes catching the flicker of torchlight upon the portraits of past monarchs, and he thought of how each had commanded their own bedchamber in ways that reinforced their rule. For the royal bed was not merely a place for sleep, but the very center of authority, where the ritual of the levee, the king's rising in the morning, was an opportunity for carefully chosen courtiers to witness him in his most vulnerable state. And to be included in such intimacy meant access, and access meant power, and power meant survival. The rustle of tapestries announced the movement of servants who hurried to prepare the rooms for the coming ceremony. And Thomas, though merely a junior attendant, felt a strange thrill as he realized he was witnessing something few men beyond palace walls could imagine. For in the Tudor world, the privilege of entering the royal bedroom was a sign of trust, a mark of favor, and often a carefully calculated reward granted to ambitious men, who would later boast of seeing the king at dawn or helping him to disrobe at night, as though the brush of linen or the glimpse of a bare shoulder carried the weight of a royal promise. That morning, as the chamberlain entered with keys that jingled like soft bells, Thomas observed how even the smallest gestures were charged with meaning. For the order in which the courtiers approached the king's bed, the sequence of hands that helped him rise, and the murmur of Latin prayers before his first words of the day all formed a ritual tapestry in which every thread mattered. And if a man was moved nearer to the king's side, it was noticed, and if another was shifted farther away, whispers would follow in the corridors like shadows of disfavor. In the outer rooms, the courtiers gathered, adjusting their doublets and smoothing their beards, speaking softly of hunting, diplomacy, or taxes, yet their eyes betrayed their true hunger, for each man desired the smallest chance to be chosen to step beyond the velvet curtain and into the private sphere of the king's bed. And Thomas thought how strange it was that the intimacy of a chamber could outweigh the battlefield or the council hall in shaping a man's fortunes, but in the Tudor court the bedroom was the throne behind the throne. As the king stirred his voice, muffled by heavy curtains, Thomas felt the room, still the very air thickening, as if the palace itself waited for permission to breathe. And when the chamberlain finally drew the curtains aside, revealing Henry's flushed face and unruly hair, Thomas saw not a sleepy man rising from his bed, but a sovereign enacting a sacred drama, his body, the symbol of England, his awakening, the dawn of the kingdom itself. And in that moment Thomas understood why men would give everything, even betray their dearest friends, for the privilege of attending this ritual. Later, as the king was dressed in rich garments of crimson and gold, his words deliberate and sparse, Thomas overheard him grant a jesting remark to one courtier about the chill of the night, and he saw how the man's eyes shone with pride, as though a single casual sentence from the king was enough to lift him above rivals. And Thomas marveled at the delicate balance of intimacy and distance, for while the courtiers saw the king's body in its private state, they never forgot that it was still sacred, still untouchable, and the closeness they were granted was both a gift and a leash. When the ceremony concluded and the procession moved toward the chapel, Thomas lingered, his thoughts heavy with what he had seen, and he wondered about the queen's bedchamber, about how her rising and retiring mirrored the king's, though her rituals carried different meanings. For while the king's body was the body politic, the queen's body was the vessel of dynasty, and her bed was the stage where the future of England might be secured or lost. And so the courtiers who surrounded her were not only guardians of propriety but silent witnesses to the hopes of the realm. He recalled the hushed conversations from the previous night about how the Queen's physicians recorded the timing of her cycles, how her ladies-in-waiting were chosen not merely for loyalty but for discretion, and how the privilege of being near her bed meant hearing the faintest sighs of joy or despair that could signal a pregnancy or its loss. And Thomas shuddered, realizing that in these private chambers the fate of kingdoms was woven with threads of flesh and blood, and that the Tudor obsession with bedroom privileges was not only about favor, but about survival, for without heirs thrones toppled. As evening fell, and the palace quieted, save for the crackling of braziers and the muffled laughter of guards, Thomas found himself again in the gallery, his reflection faint in the glass panes, and he whispered to himself that in this world the bed was never only a bed, for in it were written the laws of succession, the fortunes of nobles, and the rise and fall of nations. And as he extinguished the candles, he knew he had only begun to glimpse the true depths of what it meant to serve in the royal chambers of the Tudors. The morning light seeped through the narrow windows of Greenwich Palace, spilling across the gilded walls and settling on tapestries that depicted ancient battles and mythic kings, and within the quiet chambers of Sir Edmund, the old courtier, who had once been young enough to watch Henry VIII ride out in full armor, there was a stillness broken only by the scratch of his quill as he began to write down the things he had seen, and more importantly the things he had kept silent about for decades, for he knew that time was no longer his ally, and that his memory, still sharp though his hands trembled, was the last repository of secrets that had shaped the realm. He wrote of how the phrase "the king's bedroom privilege" had been whispered with a mixture of awe and fear, because it was not merely about who lay beside the sovereign, but about who was admitted to the intimate space of decision and vulnerability. And he recalled the years when Henry's privy chamber attendants were not just servants, but power brokers, men who chose when the king was disturbed, who saw him in his nightshirt, who overheard his sighs, his frustrations, his whispers in the dark, when his body ached and his heart was unsettled, and how these men had been feared, even by noble lords, because they controlled the gateway to majesty itself. Sir Edmund paused, dipped his quill again, and remembered one winter night when the king had been restless, pacing in his chamber, while the courtiers outside, pretending to sleep on benches, waited for the moment when they might be summoned, and he himself had been called in to read aloud from a chronicle of King Arthur, his voice shaking not from cold but from the knowledge that every word spoken in the king's bedroom could shape the mood of the sovereign and thus the fate of England. For if Henry was soothed, decisions were postponed, but if he was angered, even an ill-timed cough could change the course of a man's life. In his writing he lingered on the role of the Queen's attendants, the women who tended Catherine of Aragon and later Anne Boleyn, and how their duty was not simply to serve but to act as watchful eyes, recording in memory every sigh, every moment of weakness, every hint of the king's affection or displeasure, for in the Tudor court the bedroom was not a retreat but a theatre, and those who were present performed constantly. Knowing that history could pivot on the smallest detail observed when the doors were closed, he recalled the heavy oak door of the Queen's chamber, with its bolts and guards, and how its unlocking during ceremonial bedchamber rituals was an act watched by dozens of courtiers. For the moment when the royal couple withdrew together was not an escape into privacy, but a public sign of legitimacy, a performance meant to reassure all of Europe that heirs would be born. And he remembered standing among the throng of ambassadors and bishops, pretending to avert his eyes as the bed curtains were drawn, though everyone knew that this staging was less about intimacy and more about politics dressed as marriage. Sir Edmund sighed, for he also remembered darker nights, when rumors of impotence, infertility, and betrayal rippled through the court like fire in dry grass, and the same bedroom that had once symbolized power and unity became a crucible of suspicion, where queens feared the loss of their crowns and even their lives, and where men and women who had once been trusted attendants suddenly found themselves accused of treachery for being too close to the royal bed. He thought of Anne Boleyn, how her laughter in the privy chamber had once intoxicated Henry, how the intimacy of shared jokes had given her ascendancy over noble rivals, and yet how that same nearness later condemned her. For when the king grew weary, the very privilege that had raised her was twisted into accusations of adultery and witchcraft, and Sir Edmund, though he had not spoken then, had seen the silent terror in her eyes when the chamber that once promised power had turned into a prison of rumor and betrayal. The candle beside him sputtered as he continued to write, his quill scratching out memories of Edward VI's reign, when the boy king's bedchamber had been both a nursery and a council chamber, filled with the whispers of ambitious protectors who controlled not only the king's meals and clothing but the very access to his ears. and how the concept of bedroom privilege was no less dangerous when the monarch was a child. For whoever whispered into the ears of a sleeping king could shape the policies of a kingdom. Sir Edmund knew he was tiring, yet he forced himself to remember the years of Mary. When the Queen's bedroom had been the stage for desperate hopes of an heir that never came, and the silent mourning of her ladies-in-waiting who watched her pace at night, her hands pressed to her abdomen, believing she felt life that was never there, and how the intimate sorrow of her bedchamber became the gossip of Europe. For in the Tudor court the body of the monarch was never private, but always public, always scrutinized, always judged. At last he came to Elizabeth, the great queen, whose bedchamber privileges were transformed into weapons of statecraft, for she alone, unlike the others, mastered the art of making intimacy into spectacle, surrounding herself with favorites who were permitted to help her undress or place her in bed, yet always keeping them uncertain of whether they were truly favored or merely being used as pawns in her game. And Sir Edmund recalled how he had once watched her laugh as courtiers competed to hold her slippers, knowing full well that her bedroom was not a sanctuary, but a throne room by other means. He laid down his quill hands, trembling eyes heavy, but in his heart he knew that the truth of the Tudor bedroom was this, that it had never been about love or sleep or even pleasure, but about power. And those who had walked softly across the chamber floors, whether kings, queens, or servants, had always been treading a stage where every gesture was political, every whisper was dangerous, and every privilege could be both a blessing and a curse. And as the candle burned low, Sir Edmund whispered to himself that he had seen the truth of the bedchamber, that it was the place where England's fate had so often been decided, not in the council chambers or the battlefield, but in the quiet, intimate, perilous space where kings and queens laid their heads. The corridors of Hampton Court glimmered with torchlight as the night deepened, and within the royal chambers the air was heavy with the scent of roses and burning tallow, for this was not just a palace of politics and ceremony, but also a house where the very private spaces of the monarch were transformed into theatres of power. And in those hours when Henry VIII withdrew to his bedchamber, the business of state seemed never truly to leave him for the rituals of entry. Presence and withdrawal within the royal bedroom became an extension of governance itself. It is here that one must pause to understand how strange and yet crucial the bedroom privileges were in Tudor courts. For while to modern minds the bedchamber might seem a place of intimacy and seclusion, in Henry's world it was the very opposite. A semi-public stage where trusted courtiers called the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber were permitted to witness, attend, and even assist the king in his most vulnerable hours, dressing him, carrying his nightclothes, or standing silently while he prepared for rest. And their access gave them not only proximity to his person but also to his thoughts, his moods, and his whispered words, which could change the course of the kingdom. Henry, who had grown increasingly wary of the formal structures of council and parliament, came to rely on the companionship of these men more than on the stiff traditions of governance, and it was through the bedroom door that many rose to prominence, for access was everything, and to be present at the king's bedside was to be trusted above all others. Yet this privilege was a double-edged sword, for with intimacy came danger and those who displeased. Henry in this private sphere often found their downfall swifter than those who merely opposed him in council. For betrayal of bedroom trust was betrayal of the monarch's very self. The rituals themselves were deliberate, for every act, whether helping the king into his gown, offering a towel after washing, or preparing the great bed with its velvet hangings, was a symbolic reinforcement of hierarchy and favor, reminding all present that the body of the king was sacred, that to touch him or even witness his nightly routines was a political honor that spoke louder than any title written in parchment. And Henry relished this theater, for it allowed him to elevate and humiliate at will, to grant or withhold the golden prize of closeness. But Henry was not the only monarch whose bedroom was both fortress and stage. For his daughters, Elizabeth and Mary, would inherit this peculiar system, adapting it to their own reigns. And here the meaning of bedroom privilege shifted again, for a queen's chamber demanded an even more delicate balance between privacy, modesty, and politics. As the court swirled with speculation about marriage, heirs, and the secret whispers of potential suitors, In Elizabeth's reign, the bedroom became the most carefully guarded space of all, for she cultivated a mystique of virginity and aloofness, and every maid of honor, every lady who carried her nightrobe or brushed her hair before sleep became both witness and participant in the performance of her chastity. For Elizabeth knew that her body was not her own, but a matter of state, a symbol of national independence, against foreign dynasties who sought alliance through marriage, and thus the simple act of who entered her chamber was a statement of trust and political strategy. What did it mean, then, to have bedroom privileges in these Tudor courts? It meant far more than attendance at bedtime, for it was a key into the private machinery of monarchy, a chance to whisper a petition when the candlelight dimmed, a chance to catch the monarch's ear away from the formality of council, and those small moments could make or ruin fortunes, alter alliances, and redirect the flow of England's destiny. And yet, woven through these privileges was always the hum of risk, for the bedroom was a place of rumor as much as favor, and tongues wagged quickly when rival courtiers claimed that another had gained the king's or queen's ear during the soft hours of night. And jealousy bred poison, both literal and figurative, as accusations of manipulation, witchcraft, or treason could emerge from nothing more than who had carried the basin of water or adjusted the coverlet on the royal bed. Thus the Tudor bedchamber was a paradoxical space, both the most intimate and the most political of all rooms in the palace, a place where monarchs pretended to retreat but in truth continued the business of ruling, where courtiers bowed not only before thrones but before pillows, and where the privilege of presence at the royal bedside was coveted with the same hunger as land, gold, or noble title. And as the candle burned low and the curtains of Henry's bed were drawn shut by trusted hands, the whispers of the court never ceased, for outside that velvet cocoon waited men and women whose futures depended on what had been spoken, seen, or even silently inferred in the shadowy realm of the royal bedroom. And it is here more than anywhere else that we see the true meaning of privilege, not as comfort or luxury, but as dangerous proximity to power cloaked in intimacy. The morning after the dramatic quarrel between Queen Catherine and King Henry, the court hummed with anticipation as the tale of her defiance spread from servant to servant, from lady-in-waiting to noble lord, until even the stable boys were whispering about how their queen had stood before her husband, with such unwavering dignity that it seemed she was a figure carved of marble rather than flesh, and yet behind the dignity there was fear. For every person in the palace knew that no one, not even a queen, could openly defy the will of Henry VIII without consequence. And as Catherine sat in her chamber with her rosary beads slipping through her fingers, she prayed not only for her own safety but also for the preservation of her daughter's birthright, which she knew was the true target of Henry's wrath. And in the privacy of those prayers she wept quietly because she felt the net tightening around her. In the days that followed, the Privy Chamber became a battlefield of whispers where the king's most trusted gentlemen maneuvered like pieces on a chessboard, each seeking to align themselves with Anne Boleyn's rising star. For it was now clear to all that Henry's passion for her was no passing infatuation but a consuming fire that demanded to be legitimized. And those who once bowed to Catherine with reverence now turned their eyes toward Anne with cautious respect, while others muttered that they would rather serve a true queen of royal birth than a mere lady whose wit and beauty were her only weapons. And in this atmosphere of shifting loyalties, Sir Thomas Wyatt, poet and courtier, observed everything with the detached eye of a man who loved words more than politics, though even he could not help but be drawn into Anne's orbit, composing verses that hinted at his admiration while never daring to declare it openly. Meanwhile, in the great gallery where ambassadors gathered beneath tapestries depicting the conquests of past English kings, debates raged about the implications of Henry's intentions, for if he set aside Catherine and declared his marriage void, what would become of the treaties with Spain? What would become of the alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor? And most dangerously, what would become of the Church's authority if the Pope refused to grant his request? And these questions swelled like storm clouds over the court, making every banquet, every masque, every hunt in the royal parks feel less like celebration and more like a performance staged to conceal the underlying dread. And yet Henry himself, in the full bloom of his arrogance, strode through these gatherings with laughter booming, as though he alone was certain that God favored his desires. It was during this tense period that the tradition of the bedroom privilege took on an even sharper edge, for the king now used it as a means to test loyalties and humiliate Catherine further, summoning his favored gentlemen to join him in Anne's chambers after supper, where music played and laughter echoed, while Catherine remained isolated in her apartments, excluded from the rituals that once affirmed her status as the heart of the Tudor household, and her ladies whispered in anguish at how cruelly the king flaunted his preference. But Catherine bore it with outward serenity, reminding her companions that she was still Henry's true wife in the eyes of God, though inside she felt the slow erosion of her dignity as each day passed without the honor of the king as nightly visit. One night, however, Henry overstepped even by his own standards, for after drinking deeply with his companions and basking in Anne's flirtations, he led the entire company into Catherine's chamber unannounced, demanding that they all witness how cold and unyielding she was compared to the warmth of Anne. And though Catherine's face remained composed, her hands clenched upon the rosary so tightly that the beads left marks in her palm. And when Henry mocked her with a jest about age and barrenness, she rose slowly, bowed her head, and spoke in a voice so steady that it silenced the chamber. "My lord, you shame not me but yourself, for it is God who gives children and God who withholds them, and it is he, not you, who will be my judge." And in that moment even the most hardened of Henry's companions felt the sting of her words, though none dared say so aloud. After that night, Catherine's dignity became her greatest weapon, and it unsettled Henry more than anger would have, for every display of patience reminded him that his cruelty could not break her, and Anne, who had once mocked the queen in private, began to grow uneasy at Catherine's unshakable presence, for she realized that as long as Catherine lived and claimed the title of queen, her own position would never be entirely secure, and so she pressed Henry all the harder to move forward with the annulment, whispering to him that his kingdom would not respect a man who could not command his own household, and that the crown itself demanded he act decisively, and Henry, already convinced of his righteousness, allowed her urgings to feed his growing obsession with breaking free from Catherine. But while the king and Anne plotted their path forward, a subtler game unfolded in the shadows, for Thomas Cromwell, rising in influence, studied the bedroom rituals not as symbols of love or humiliation, but as tools of power, and he began to envision a reformation of the very structures that allowed kings and queens to rule, seeing in Henry's desire for not merely a scandal but an opportunity to challenge the Pope's supremacy and reshape England as destiny. And so he watched with careful eyes as the bedchamber remained the stage upon which all the greatest dramas of the realm unfolded, knowing that in the end, it was not kisses or whispers in the dark that mattered, but the vast consequences they set into motion, consequences that would alter the fate of England forever. As the court settled into the lingering chill of an English spring, with fires roaring in the great halls and courtiers, wrapping themselves in silks and furs against draughts that whistled through the stone corridors, the delicate balance of intrigue and ritual within the royal bedchamber remained ever more pronounced, for now the king had taken to using his bedroom as both a sanctuary of whispered confessions and a stage for subtle political displays, and so every privilege granted there carried an added weight. Every presence or absence was interpreted as a sign of favor or displeasure. In those long hours when servants came and went with bowls of warmed wine, trays of honeyed sweets, or velvet-lined boxes carrying letters sealed in wax, the courtiers who managed to gain entry to the private chamber found themselves in a place where the formal rules of public ceremony loosened into something more intimate, yet no less perilous, because here the monarchist's humor shifted with the turn of a phrase or the arch of an eyebrow, and a careless word spoken at the bedside might shape the future of a noble family's fortunes. It was in this softened atmosphere of low candlelight and the scent of rosewater sprinkled upon the sheets that the ritual of bedchamber attendance revealed itself as more than a matter of service, for to be called upon to help the king undress, to hand him his nightshirt, or to fetch his slippers in the morning was not merely an act of obedience, but rather a ritual laden with symbolism, reminding all present that intimacy with the monarch was both a privilege and a danger, a moment where the bonds of trust between ruler and servant were displayed openly before envious rivals. Often the chamber would fill with a strange mix of silence and whispers, the rustle of tapestries, blending with the murmured voices of men who dared to test the edges of the king's patience by mentioning petitions, suggesting alliances, or recounting news from distant shires. And though such conversations seemed casual, every word was carefully weighed, for this was the stage upon which policy was often born, not in the council chamber, but in the warmth of the royal bedchamber, where walls listened and the flicker of candlelight made faces appear more vulnerable than they ever did by day. And while male courtiers jostled for such privilege, the women of the court played their own games in adjoining rooms, their presence near the royal bed never accidental, for queens, mistresses, and ladies-in-waiting all understood that proximity to the bedroom meant proximity to power, and so they positioned themselves cleverly, offering gentle words of comfort or subtle glances of encouragement, knowing that the king might later recall their presence when decisions of inheritance, marriage, or influence arose. The ritual of rising, known as the lever, became its own theatre, for when the monarch awoke, rubbed his eyes against the pale light creeping through narrow windows, and allowed his servants to dress him piece by piece in garments of silk and velvet, those permitted to enter stood with bowed heads waiting for the moment when he might share an unguarded thought, a jest, or even a complaint about the stiffness of his boots, and each word was remembered as though it were prophecy, carried through the corridors of power like a sacred text. At times, ambassadors from foreign courts were granted the rare privilege of witnessing such morning routines, and these men, hardened by diplomacy, would later write in their dispatches how the Tudor court mixed splendor with intimacy, how a king might sit half-dressed while listening to news of battles in Italy or disputes among German princes, and yet no one dared see this as indignity, for it was instead a deliberate reminder that in England, power was not only displayed upon the throne but also within the sanctity of the royal bed. Yet for all the glamour surrounding these rituals, there was a darker underside, for rumors spread quickly in the half-light of bedchambers, and secrets whispered between sheets could ruin reputations as swiftly as they elevated them. And so the privilege of bedroom access became a blade that cut both ways, granting immense influence but also exposing courtiers to suspicion, jealousy, and the ever-present threat of being cast out should the king grow weary of their presence. Thus, as the nights grew longer and the flickering of candles revealed faces lined with both ambition and fear, it became clear to those who lingered nearest to the bed that royal bedroom privileges were never merely about who tied a ribbon, poured a cup, or carried a robe, but rather about who dared to step into the fragile space where the monarch's body and the kingdom's future intertwined, where the boundaries between the personal and the political dissolved, and where each gesture, however small, could echo far beyond the chamber walls. And so within this quiet theatre of silk sheets and murmured conversations, the story of Tudor power unfolded not just in the grandeur of coronations or the thunder of cannons, but in the simple yet dangerous act of standing near the royal bed where privilege, ritual, and destiny wove themselves into the fabric of history. The corridors of Whitehall Palace seemed to stretch endlessly as Thomas Braine made his way back from the chamber of Mistress Marjorie Seymour, his mind still reeling with the revelation that the delicate tapestries on her walls had not only concealed old drafts of the stone, but had also muffled whispers of secret conversations that had passed between her and ladies who once served Anne Boleyn, for as he pondered these hushed recollections he realized with sudden clarity that the true power of the bedroom privilege in Tudor courts was not only that one might gain entry to the private chamber, but that one might also shape what was remembered, and what was deliberately forgotten, for walls did not carry voices outward, yet they absorbed stories, like cloth absorbs wine to be wrung out later when convenient. As the bells tolled softly from St. Margaret's across the river, Thomas stopped beneath a hanging torch and felt the draught of winter creep through the crack of the stone floor, and with it came a strange awareness that the architecture itself seemed complicit in these privileges. For the labyrinth of galleries and privy chambers had been designed with deliberate intent to filter visitors like a sieve, first through waiting rooms and then into guard chambers and then finally into the presence of bedchambers where intimacy was carefully staged. so that those who crossed each threshold grew fewer until at last only the trusted, the favored, or the daring could pass into the space, where the monarch lay in vulnerability, and yet this vulnerability was but a costume, a performance for those permitted to witness it. That night, restless and unable to sleep, Thomas walked quietly into the long gallery, where portraits of monarchs and courtiers lined the walls, and as he gazed into the painted eyes of Henry VIII, in his youth still slim and radiant, he wondered how many of those who once entered the king's private chamber had done so to share in his pleasures, and how many had done so to secure alliances. For the bed had never been simply a place for slumber, but rather a stage where favors were granted, grievances aired, or ambitions advanced. And it struck Thomas that the soft pillows and embroidered sheets had absorbed more confessions and secret oaths than the council chambers ever had. The next morning, at dawn, Thomas overheard two grooms whispering outside the stables about how the privilege of watching the king rise from bed, a ceremony known as was considered an honor greater than the granting of coin. For to witness the king in his vulnerable state of waking was to be entrusted with the illusion that one stood closer to his humanity. And yet Thomas thought to himself with a mix of awe and suspicion that this trust was perhaps the most carefully constructed illusion of all. For the monarch who seemed unguarded upon rising was, in truth, surrounded by layers of ceremony that ensured that every movement, every stretch of arm, and every rub of tired eyes served as a performance for the chosen few. As the days passed, Thomas found himself increasingly fascinated, not merely by the act of entering the royal bedroom, but by the ripple effect it created. For once, a courtier had been observed at the king's side in the chamber. Others at court would bow deeper, speak more cautiously, and spread whispers of new influence. And soon the one who had entered the chamber would be courted himself with gifts and petitions, as though proximity to the bed translated directly into proximity to power. And this realization stirred in Thomas a mixture of wonder and dread, for he began to understand that his own place in these unfolding narratives was shifting, slowly, invisibly, like a boat carried by an unseen tide. Late one evening, when the palace was hushed and the flicker of torches cast long shadows against the oak beams, Thomas sat in the chamber of his uncle, Master Brain, who poured wine into a pewter cup and leaned close to tell him that the greatest danger of the bedroom privilege was not that one might be excluded, but that one might be remembered in the wrong way. For many who entered in favor left in disgrace, accused of speaking too freely or of betraying some unguarded glance of the monarch. And as he listened, Thomas realized that the bedroom was both cradle and gallows, capable of raising one into intimacy or plunging one into ruin. And it struck him as a paradox that the very closeness that one longed for could in the end prove fatal. The next morning brought with it a spectacle that etched itself into Thomas's mind, for he was summoned along with several others to witness the king's rising, and as the curtains were drawn back to reveal Henry upon his bed, surrounded by the heavy scent of musk and the glint of gold embroidery, Thomas watched in silence as the grooms of the stool moved with delicate precision to assist in the rituals of dressing, each action performed with such deliberate reverence that it seemed less an act of service and more a liturgy. And in that moment Thomas understood that the chamber was a church of its own kind, with the king as both priest and deity, and those who attended him as acolytes granted access to sacred mysteries. And yet, as Thomas left the chamber that day, the cold air of the gallery pressing against his flushed cheeks, he could not help but recall the look in the eyes of Mistress Seymour, when she had warned him that secrets once overheard in such spaces could never be unlearned. For he now carried within him the image of Henry's unguarded yawns and the sound of his groans as his stiff limbs were lifted from the mattress. And though to others it might seem a privilege, to Thomas it felt more like a burden, for he now held fragments of the king's mortality in his memory, fragile truths that were dangerous precisely because they revealed the man beneath the majesty. That night, as the palace grew still and the moonlight poured through the latticed windows, Thomas lay awake in his own small chamber and felt as though the very stones around him whispered with stories of countless nights when monarchs had lain with queens, mistresses, and confidants, their bodies entwined, not only in pleasure but in politics, and he realized with quiet dread that the true meaning of the bedroom privilege was not access to flesh or to whispered words, but access to the narrative itself. for to be present in the chamber was to become part of a story that others would later retell, reshape, or weaponize. And once one had entered, one could never again step entirely outside of that story. The castle seemed to breathe differently as winter's grip deepened, with the frost biting at the stones and the chimneys sending endless ribbons of smoke into the grey skies. And while the city beyond the gates slowed to a weary trudge beneath snow and mud, inside the palace, the life of the court spun ever faster, for the colder the air outside grew, the warmer and closer the intrigues inside became, as if the tightening cold pressed courtiers together, making their whispers sharper, their laughter louder, their rivalries more dangerous, and their secrets more entangled. And in this pressing atmosphere, the bedroom privileges of the king became all the more significant, for to be summoned, even at night, was no mere formality but a measure of one's favor, a mark of trust, and sometimes a test of loyalty. And so the lords and ladies who lingered in these corridors of silk and firelight knew well that every candle snuffed out, every Campbell door closed, and every Campbell door closed, and every murmur exchanged behinds could every chantal, and every chantop of every campus and every bamachig serix, every and ever servant, evan and pern ben gen, eb ban ben poop and pern ben plucko and burn pupin melana and pupit mup well and up but on work bop but up up where but what about work up work but lewis but all of what for work as a work of tap of bubbles up and that method go with whoever nap for whatever woman something tough from that's type of stuff and what to select Thomas, who had spent so many nights recording, remembering, and serving, noticed how the rituals of bedchamber access became almost theatrical in this season. For when the king retired and the chosen few followed, they carried with them not only torches but also the knowledge that others were left standing behind in disappointment, biting back envy, and rehearsing excuses for their exclusion. And this contrast only deepened the symbolic weight of the privilege, for to sit by the king's bed, to help with the dismissal of his robes, or even to fetch a cushion for his tired limbs, was to stand at the heart of his private world, a place where policy could be softened, where debts could be forgiven, and where promises could be forged with a glance rather than with parchment and seal. And Thomas had begun to see how these nightly gestures, though small in appearance, accumulated into great rivers of influence, shaping the kingdom itself incratulated into great waiters of it, shaping the kingulating and the kinkless semping of caping, saping the kimment of kinning and kingalux in kimmits can kinward with ficknkser for some kinbep and per and perk and perp plupper and wet whip plumber with bar with per and pup toe and with up pip with up with per with half up buff up work out what up well work up well low more wood up spur at and for best buff shis buff with active and mark malo with from it and catch buff with said I'm in the and yet, in this winter haze, rumors began to circulate that the king, restless and suspicious, had started testing the loyalty of those closest to him by shifting the patterns of his nightly summons, sometimes calling unexpected names, sometimes excluding old favorites, sometimes lingering in silence while all waited to see who would be chosen. And these games, if games they were, unsettled the court, for they revealed both his awareness of the weight of bedroom privilege and his delight in wielding it as a weapon. And Thomas, standing often in the shadows with his ink-stained fingers hidden beneath his sleeves, understood that his task was no longer simply to record, but also to survive, for knowledge of who entered the king's chamber, and in what order, and with what expression upon their face, was a dangerous kind of treasure, one that could enrich a man's position, or ruin it entirely if revealed at the wrong moment. It was in these tense nights that the queen herself seemed to glow with a strange serenity, for while others fretted at their exclusion, She maintained her calm attending upon the king when summoned, excusing herself with grace when not, and this unshakable composure gave rise to whispers that perhaps her own influence in the bedchamber, though less visible, was more enduring than any lord's. For who could rival the soft authority of a wife who knew the rhythms of her husband's moods more intimately than any courtier? And Thomas, watching her from a respectful distance, began to sense that the queen's true weapon was patience. For in a court where men jostled and strained for every scrap of access, she remained steadfast, confident that her place, though threatened in rumor, was not so easily undone in reality. But beneath this calm surface darker currents stirred, for with winter's stillness came plotting, and more than one noble sought to exploit the very system of bedroom access to advance his faction, arranging bribes with chamber servants, planting false words in the ears of those who lingered nearest the king's door, and even attempting to manipulate the order in which men were called, so that rivals would appear less favored. And in one such incident, Thomas found himself at the center, for a slip of parchment bearing a name had been pressed into his palm with the promise of coin should he ensure it reached the king's notice at just the right time. And though his heart pounded at the thought, he knew enough by now to understand that such offers were snares. For should he accept and be caught, his fate would be sealed, and should he refuse to openly, he might invite suspicion from the plotter himself. And so he mastered the art of suspicion. And so he mastered his kitchen, so he mastered him so, and so he mansing his in, and so linning sealing the sea and silly seal and simin and sealing sin and plea and pun ben and pisin and pe and per and ben pra and per me wed man wapa and ma per ma bla and ba for ma loa apa oh I'm afa for and afa wa bel pa kit club pave work up that I so was for with apa with apa will over fair away for welcome course for double was not of and what am I come from the significance of the bedroom, then, was not simply about intimacy or ritual, but about the delicate theater of access, where each gesture, each step across the threshold, and each whispered exchange in the hush of firelight carried the weight of policy and betrayal. And Thomas, though still young, understood that what he witnessed was not merely the life of a king but the anatomy of power itself. A power so subtle it could not be written openly, yet so immense it determined the course of wars, marriages, and even faith itself. And as he sat one night by the embers, quill hovering over parchment, he realized that the story he was weaving was not only for his own survival, but perhaps for history itself. For in the centuries to come men might read of treaties and armies, but they would not know that so much of it began in silence behind doors, with the simple ritual of who was allowed to stand beside the royal bed. And so, as the snow thickened against the windows and the court huddled closer within the perfumed chambers, the bedroom privileges of Tudor courts revealed themselves ever more clearly to Thomas, not as quaint customs or idle indulgences, but as the true currency of favor. The invisible scepter by which the king ruled not only his realm, but also the very souls of those who served him. And Thomas, eyes heavy yet mind awake, pressed onward in his secret chronicle, knowing that he was both witness and prisoner of the truth. As the hush of midnight spread itself over the halls of Whitehall Palace, the stone walls themselves seemed to breathe with the secrets they had absorbed through decades of laughter, quarrels, whispers, and prayers, and Margaret found herself once again sitting by the faint glow of a dying fire, her quill poised. Above parchment, the silence heavy except for the steady beat of her own heart, which told her she was on the edge of writing down not just the observations of a maid, but the hidden truth of what royal bedroom privileges had always meant. For here, within those guarded walls, the act of watching a king or queen prepare for sleep, the attendance upon them in those most private of hours, was less about comfort and more about control, less about service, and more about power for each maid, groom, or courtier allowed to witness. A sovereign disrobe was also entrusted with the dangerous knowledge of what the body of monarchy truly was, its scars, its frailties, its humanity. Margaret had grown used to the ritual, yet never fully accustomed, for each night she was reminded how much of this performance was theatre. The court assembled as though upon a stage where the king's shirt was lifted by one pair of careful hands, the stockings eased away by another, and the sovereign's body so exalted in public ceremonies reduced in those moments to the vulnerable figure of an aging man, heavy with his feasts, burdened by his thoughts, his eyes searching his attendants for signs of loyalty or betrayal. And though Henry spoke little during the nightly ritual, his silence was louder than a trumpet, for it reminded them all that even as they tucked him into bed, even as they brought warm wine to his lips, their own fates and fortunes rested in the unpredictable tides of his favor. Yet what most beyond the court never grasped was how this privilege of the bedchamber was both a blessing and a curse. For to be admitted meant proximity to power, the chance to whisper a request, to hand a petition at the precise moment the king reached for his nightcap, to exchange a look or a nod that could open doors the next day. But it also meant being chained to the whims of a sovereign who might awaken in a foul mood, who might, in a flash of suspicion, question why a certain hand had lingered too long upon the covers, who might interpret a hesitation or a stumble as disloyalty. And Margaret had seen with her own eyes how swiftly such suspicions could spread, like ink upon water, staining reputations, ruining households, sending once great men and women to the Tower before dawn broke. The nights themselves were strangely long in such company, not because of the passing hours, but because every gesture was heightened, every candle flame seemed to burn with judgment, and the courtiers, who stood near Margaret, often exchanged furtive glances, weighing their own positions, measuring their distance from the king's trust, and she could sense in them the same gnawing fear she carried. That this privilege was, in truth, a test one staged night after night, a performance of loyalty, where the smallest misstep might cost more than life itself, might cost legacy, honor, and every scrap of labor a family had built across generations. Margaret, though still young, was learning to endure the strain, and as she dipped her quill in ink, she wondered whether it was the act of watching the king undress that frightened her most, or the act of knowing that such watching was part of a game far older and more dangerous than she had first imagined. For long before Henry, and long before his father, kings had used their bedchambers not merely as places of rest, but as chambers of surveillance and ceremony. And those permitted entry were never simply attendants, they were pawns, informants, and actors upon a stage where every curtain drawn back might conceal a dagger, every whispered exchange might carry the weight of a kingdom's fate. And so, on that night, as the fire sank into embers and the great bell of the palace struck softly through the walls, Margaret closed her journal for a moment and pressed her hand to its cover, knowing she had only begun to unravel what the phrase royal bedroom privileges truly meant. For it was not about comfort nor intimacy, but about the delicate web of power, suspicion, and theatre that bound the Tudor world together. And with this thought in her mind she extinguished the final candle, leaving herself in the quiet dark, where the echoes of those ancient secrets seemed to hover in the air like a presence that would not let her sleep. The corridors of Hampton Court Palace felt strangely alive as dawn pushed its pale light through the narrow windows, and for Edmund, the young scribe who had found himself drawn deeper and deeper into the strange world of royal intimacies, the morning seemed less a renewal than an echo of all the whispers that had filled the night before, because in every hallway, in every chamber, in every rustle of curtain or creak of timber, there was the reminder that the Tudor bedchamber was not a private sanctuary, but a stage upon which reputations were made, alliances secured, and secrets kept with the precision of soldiers guarding a fortress. He had stayed awake long into the night, seated at the small desk by his chamber, scratching words into his parchment by the dim glow of a tallow candle. And the stories he wrote were no longer the neat chronicles of pageantry that he had once been asked to record, but sprawling confessions in which he tried to capture the way courtiers used the royal bedroom as both weapon and sanctuary, as though the mere act of committing these things to paper might keep him from being swallowed whole by the very intrigues he now served. This morning he had been summoned by Lord Norfolk, a man whose reputation for cold cunning was whispered about even in taverns miles from London, and when Edmund entered the chamber he felt his stomach twist, for Norfolk did not waste words, but instead gestured toward the great canopied bed in the room, its heavy curtains drawn back, its silken sheets creased from a restless night, and the sight alone carried with it the weight of unspoken accusation, as though the bed itself bore witness to the most dangerous secrets of the crown. "You must understand, boy," Norfolk had said in his low, deliberate tone. "The king's bed is not the king's alone, it belongs to the kingdom, to the council, to those who serve his majesty's interests. What is done in it, who is allowed near it, even who is permitted to watch him sleep, these things are politics, not passion, and you will keep your quill sharp, for I have need of a record that may protect me should tongues wag." Edmund bowed his head and agreed, though his mind raced, for he knew Norfolk did not simply want a chronicle. He wanted a weapon forged of words, one that might be wielded against queen, rival, or even the king himself should the balance of power tilt the wrong way. And Edmund wondered whether his hand might one day bring ruin upon a figure whose shadow now stretched across all of England. When Norfolk dismissed him, Edmund did not return to his chamber, but instead wandered the palace, for it was still early and most courtiers had not yet emerged, and in this fragile quiet, he passed the queen's apartments, where he glimpsed through an open door a maidservant shaking out the embroidered covers of the bed, and he was struck by the way even this simple act felt like theatre. The lifting of cloths and spreading of linens, an unspoken announcement that a royal night had passed, and with it the hope or despair of dynasties waiting to see if a child might soon be promised. Later that day, in the great hall, he heard the murmurs that always seemed to follow the queen, whispers about her health, about her smile, about the king's temper when she displeased him, and all of it, Edmund realized, came back to one place: the bed, the chamber, the rituals that began and ended there, as though all the grandeur of court life was merely embroidery around the central truth that the king's private life was never truly private at all. It was Lady Margaret, one of the more silver-tongued ladies-in-waiting, who pulled Edmund aside that afternoon with a knowing look, and she whispered of how last night courtiers had stood silently in the antechamber of the king's bed, watching as he was undressed by attendants, and how such rituals were not acts of intimacy but of sovereignty, designed so that no man or woman could claim ignorance of the king's condition, his strength, his very ability to rule. Edmund felt both fascinated and unsettled, for it became clear to him that to be admitted to these ceremonies was an honor that bound loyalty as surely as chains, and to be excluded was a sign of disfavor that might end one's fortunes in an instant. And he realized that his own presence, however quiet, was part of this same web that the ink he spilled might one day serve to prove who had the right to be remembered and who would be erased. That night, as he sat again by candlelight, he thought of the Tudor bed not as a place of sleep but as a throne without wood or stone, a throne made of linen and whispers, one upon which England's fate was decided each night in ways more subtle and more dangerous than any battle. And with that thought, he dipped his quill and began again, knowing that every word he wrote carried the weight of secrets too heavy to ever be spoken aloud. As the candlelight flickered in the high-ceilinged chamber where Thomas More once kept his books, before his fall from grace, William sat alone with parchment spread before him, the night air drifting in through a cracked shutter, bringing with it the faint scent of the river and the hushed murmur of the guards changing their watch. And he found himself thinking of how the privileges of the bedchamber were not just rituals of intimacy but of immense political weight. For within those walls where silk curtains were drawn and Russia's muffled footsteps, the whispered confessions of kings and queens could shape the fate of nobles and commoners alike, and the careful placement of one trusted servant by the royal bed could be the difference between life and death for an ambitious courtier. He remembered how, during his younger years in the service of the Duke of Norfolk, he overheard talk of Henry VIII's growing suspicion that his Queen Anne Boleyn had too many eyes upon her bedchamber, and that these eyes might not be entirely innocent, and William realized in that moment that to hold the key to such a sacred space was to hold power beyond swords or proclamations. For what one witnessed in those intimate hours could be whispered later to an eager ear in the council chamber, turning affection into accusation and secrecy into scandal. And it dawned upon him how dangerous it was to live so near to the heartbeat of the monarchy. The chroniclers had often written of the splendor of court entertainments, of banquets that gleamed with roasted swan and gilded marchpane, Yet they wrote less of the quiet watch by the chamber door, where a gentleman of the privy chamber might sit sleepless, straining to hear whether the king muttered in his sleep of fears or betrayals, for those mutterings could be used by rivals to whisper to foreign ambassadors that England's lion was troubled, and William, remembering his own long nights standing sentinel outside the Queen's apartments, shivered at how a careless cough, a misplaced glance, or the creak of a leather boot could mark one forever as either loyal confidant or potential spy. It was in those shadows that the bedchamber privileges truly revealed their double edge. For though they brought one close to the warmth of the monarch's trust, they also placed one in the line of suspicion, and William recalled vividly the story of Sir Henry Norris, once so favoured in Henry's presence, who attended him in his most private quarters, only to find himself accused of treachery with the Queen, dragged to the scaffold with his intimacy turned into a weapon against him. And as William dipped his quill into the ink, he whispered to himself that the bedchamber was never a place of simple rest, but a theatre of power where every curtain concealed both tenderness and treachery. On another page, his hand slower now, he wrote of the ritual that marked a king's rising, the levee, when gentlemen of the chamber would draw back the heavy hangings, light the fire, bring water for washing, and dress their sovereign with hands that had to be steady and respectful, for any trembling might suggest guilt, and in that ceremony William saw not merely service but a form of silent politics, for to hand the king his shirt was to prove trustworthiness. To be admitted so close to his body was to receive unspoken confirmation that one's loyalty outweighed others, and to be excluded was to know that whispers had already begun in corners of the palace where envy thrived. These thoughts haunted William as the hour crept past midnight, and he realized that while histories spoke of treaties, marriages, and battles, the true foundations of Tudor power often lay behind closed doors, where the rustle of sheets and the murmur of servants testified to alliances invisible to the public eye. And he thought of the young apprentices who dreamed of glory at court, not knowing that glory might mean nothing more than carrying a basin into a silent chamber and bowing low, while the monarch yawned. Yet from such humble acts the ladders of favor were built, and from those ladders men might climb to dizzying heights or fall into dungeons. As William paused, setting aside his quill to gaze at the glowing embers, he thought of the irony that while the court's chroniclers filled their pages with grand feasts, coronations, and jousts, it was the quiet drama of who was allowed to enter the royal bedchamber that often determined which cousin was married off, which foreign envoy received confidence, which minister gained the king's ear. And in that silence William understood that he had lived in a theatre where the bed was both stage and throne, where privacy was illusion, and where the privileges of intimacy were masks worn by power itself. And so, as the night stretched onward and his eyelids grew heavy, he promised himself that he would commit these hidden truths to memory, not for glory, nor for ambition, but because he feared that without record the world would forget that the great storm of Tudor politics was often stirred not in the council hall or the battlefield, but in the velvet-draped silence of a royal bedroom. The chamber remained wrapped in silence, and though William had at last found some uneasy rest, the memories of those who had fallen from the high graces of the king's bedchamber trust haunted him, for it was well known in the Tudor court that such intimacy with the sovereign was as dangerous as it was coveted, a fire that gave warmth but could scorch with a sudden shift of wind. And as the candlelight guttered out in his mind's eye, he saw the faces of men who had once stood where he now stood, men who whispered in the king's ear, shared in his secrets, even handed him his shirt at dawn, only to later be discarded, disgraced, or destroyed for the smallest misstep, the most innocent presumption, or the whisper of an accusation that spread through the court like a fever. He thought first of those who had held the sacred keys to the privy chamber in Henry's early reign, figures like William Compton, who once was as close as a brother to the young king, laughing with him in jousts, dining beside him in merriment, and yet when suspicion fell upon him in whispers of secret liaisons and the politics of loyalty, his fortune dimmed, his power withered, and though he escaped the ultimate punishment of the axe, he died young, carrying with him the burden of having been both indispensable and disposable in the king's shifting favor. But then, darker visions crept into William's thoughts. but the history of the bedchamber was littered not just with dismissals but with executions, and he recalled the tale of Henry Norris, groom of the stool under the mighty Henry VIII. A man so trusted he controlled the king's most private moments and affairs. One who held the king's secrets, finances, and confidence, until the storm of Anne Boleyn's fall drew him into the maelstrom of charges, and despite his loyalty, he was accused of treasonous intimacy with the queen, condemned on evidence thinner than a shadow, and sent to the scaffold where his head was struck clean from his shoulders, all because proximity to power had painted him as a target when the king's heart and mind turned cruel. The more William thought, the more he realized the bedchamber was not merely a place of silken sheets and whispered confidences, but a battlefield, one fought not with swords but with glances, rumors, and hidden daggers of intrigue. For to gain entry to that sacred space was to rise above the noble ranks, yet each step closer to the sovereign's pillow was also a step closer to the executioner's block. For one mistake could mean that the hand once trusted to hand the king his nightshirt might instead be bound by chains, the voice once welcomed in midnight, counsel silenced forever by the fall of a blade in the Tower Yard. He had heard old courtiers mutter of the downfall of Thomas Cromwell, who, though not a bedchamber man himself, had used his influence over the king's personal routines and choices to wield unmatched power, arranging marriages and reforms, only to be undone when his control seemed too great, his hand too firmly on the levers of intimacy. And William knew well that, if Cromwell could be torn down from such heights, then how much more fragile were the lives of grooms, gentlemen, and keepers who attended the king in the fragile hours of night. Even those who survived dismissal carried scars, for to be expelled from the king's chamber was to be exiled from the center of courtly gravity, a living death of irrelevance. And William imagined the faces of those who had once boasted of their closeness, striding proudly in rich robes, only to later wander. Corridors ignored their enemies, emboldened their names, whispered only as cautionary tales for new attendants like himself. The dangers were not always born of treachery or failure, for sometimes simply being too close, too trusted, too familiar could breed envy in others, and envy in the Tudor court was sharper than any sword. For William had seen how men of higher rank watched the grooms of the chamber with thinly veiled hatred, muttering that it was beneath their dignity that simple-born servants could influence royal moods more than dukes or lords, and so they spread their venom in subtle accusations, ensuring that the very proximity that raised a man could just as easily topple him by nightfall. As William's mind drifted in this storm of memory and fear, he understood that every night he spent within these walls was a gamble, a delicate balancing act where silence and loyalty were not enough, where he must master the art of discretion so completely that even his own shadow might betray no hint of thought. For in this world the cost of trust was measured not in coin but in heads. And he resolved, as the first shafts of dawn crept through the shutters, that he would survive where others had not. Though even he knew such vows were fragile things in the Tudor court, where the fate of a man could turn with the king's mood as swiftly as day turned to night. The morning came slowly, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over Whitehall, its pale light filtering through mist that curled above the Thames like breath from some great creature, and William, who had not slept, found himself walking the galleries before most of the palace had stirred. The echo of his steps the only sound in chambers that had witnessed secrets too heavy for dawn, and with each corridor he crossed he felt the strange weight of knowledge settle deeper on his shoulders, the realization that the king's bedchamber, that small and seemingly private world of sleep, intimacy, and vulnerability, was no mere chamber at all, but the very stage upon which power bent and shifted, where the life of the kingdom's master could be protected, controlled, or even betrayed. And William knew in his heart that the men who had sought the privilege of that chamber were not merely competing for favor, but were struggling for the keys to the kingdom itself. By the time the palace bells rang and servants began to stir with trays of bread, ale, and steaming pots of spiced broth for the kitchens, the first of the rivals had already begun his day's campaign for Sir Edward Harcourt, a man with ambitions, cut sharper than his grimmed beard, lingered outside the Privy Gallery, dressed in silks of muted blue, a color chosen not for flamboyance but for quiet confidence, and as the younger pages whispered his name, William could not help but notice how Edward's eyes never rested on one thing for long, flicking instead from door to door, from servant to guard, as if every corner held a piece of the puzzle he intended to assemble. And it became clear that Edward's game was not one of sudden boldness, but of constant presence, of being everywhere at once, until even the king himself might feel that he had always been near. Not long after, another figure arrived, Lord Francis de Clare, whose family's fortunes rose and fell like the tides, yet who carried himself with the assurance of one who had long ago decided that he was destined for the inner circle. And Francis, unlike Edward, pursued his schemes not with quiet infiltration but with displays of loyalty so exaggerated that courtiers often smirked behind their hands, though none dared laugh too loudly, for the king himself was known to enjoy Francis's flatteries, his loud laughter, and his ability to turn even the king's smallest remark into a declaration of genius. And William, observing from a shadowed alcove, wondered whether the man's hollow words hid a dangerous truth, that beneath the humor there lay a hunger to become indispensable, to be the constant mirror reflecting the king's image back at him, until no day might pass without his presence. As the hours of morning thickened with noise, the clatter of dishes, the sweep of rushes on the floors, the laughter of the washerwomen carrying linens through the courtyard, the rivalries sharpened, and William found himself caught in the strange theater of ambition, each man performing as though the corridors themselves were filled with invisible spectators, and though the king still slept, safe within his chamber, his courtiers fought already for the right to be closest when he awoke, for that moment of intimacy, of lifting a curtain or handing a robe, could mean the difference between exile and influence, between whispering in the royal ear or fading into silence. And William, tightening his hands behind his back, swore inwardly that he would not be outplayed in this drama, no matter how many rivals stood in his path. It was then that whispers of a darker scheme reached him, carried on the low voices of two minor servants who did not notice his approach, for they spoke of a rumor that had wound its way through the kitchens and laundries that one among the rivals had no intention of merely currying favor but meant to compromise the king's trust entirely, perhaps through letters intercepted, or secrets sold, or even through manipulation of the bedchamber routines, so that certain eyes might see the king vulnerable when others could not. And William, though he pretended not to hear, felt a chill crawl down his spine, for the privilege of the bedchamber was no longer simply a contest of courtesy and loyalty, but a game in which treachery itself had entered as a player, and in such a game the cost of losing could be not merely exile but the undoing of a kingdom. As the sun climbed higher, gilding the palace roofs and spilling through stained glass in shards of red and gold, William made his way toward the outer chamber, where the king would soon rise, and there he saw gathered the cluster of men who sought to enter the sanctum of the bedchamber itself, their faces outwardly calm but their eyes sharp as blades. And for a moment William felt himself standing in the midst of a battlefield disguised by velvet and lace, a battlefield where swords were hidden behind words, where daggers lay beneath smiles, and where victory would not be measured in blood spilled, but in access, granted in secrets overheard, in whispers spoken at the edge of a bed where the kingdom's master lay. Half awakened, William understood with a sudden clarity that the greatest danger of all was not the enemy without, but the rival within, the man who could step past guards and locks because he was welcomed as a servant and a friend. That morning, as the doors were opened and the first of the rituals of waking began, William felt the shifting of the court like the turning of a tide, the rivals pressing forward with gifts, with jokes, with remarks rehearsed in silence long before, each seeking to secure that fleeting intimacy. And William, standing ready with his own duties, realized that the true test of his resolve had only begun, for every day henceforth would bring fresh schemes, new dangers, and sharper rivalries, all circling around the king's bed as though it were a throne unto itself. And William, clutching his resolve like a weapon, vowed that no matter how dark these games became, he would stand guard against them, even if it meant stepping into shadows where others feared to tread. As the first pale streaks of dawn filtered through the mullioned windows of Whitehall, the court was already alive with the low hum of plotting voices and shuffling feet, for in those hours, Before the king himself emerged from his guarded sanctuary of sleep, the corridors outside his bedchamber became a theater where ambition and resentment played themselves out in whispers and sidelong glances. And William, standing at his accustomed post near the doorway, could feel the charge in the air. The way men who yesterday had been companions in merriment now stood like wary opponents, each measuring the other, each silently calculating who might gain or lose. Favor depending on whose hand was permitted to hold the basin of water, whose fingers drew the curtain aside, whose lips spoke the first greeting that Henry would hear upon opening his eyes. And though William kept his face calm, his eyes lowered in a manner that bespoke humility, within him a storm churned, for he knew that beneath the polished courtesy of the lords who drifted near, beneath their bowing and murmured phrases of loyalty, there lay sharp knives honed on envy. For every man here understood that the bedchamber was not merely a place of sleep, but the true heart of power. For in the hush of those private moments a king could be swayed more deeply than in the echoing halls of council. A jest murmured at the bedside, a tale told in the quiet of undress, might alter the fate of nations. And William now stood as both gatekeeper and potential target, a man whose very presence blocked the ambitions of others. The Duke of Suffolk arrived first, his broad shoulders filling the passage as he cast a glance at William that was half amusement, half warning, for Suffolk had long believed that his own stature, his battles fought at the king's side, his marriage into the royal family, gave him natural precedence over younger, lesser-born courtiers, and yet he too had been made to linger at the threshold while William busied himself with the king's chamberlain's duties. And though Suffolk smiled, the smile was edged like a sword left half-drawn. And William knew this was a man who might one day decide it was safer to see him undone. Then came Norfolk, his hawk-like gaze sharp even in the dim light, a man whose pride in lineage was as vast as his hunger for influence, and he too approached with the air of one who believed his blood entitled him to nearer access. Yet William could sense beneath that hauteur a certain caution, for Norfolk knew that Henry trusted none more than those who saw him in his most unguarded state. And William had become one of those rare few, which meant that even a duke must measure his steps with care, lest the king interpret a move as overbold. And then quieter but no less dangerous came a cluster of younger men courtiers, whose fine doublets and eager eyes betrayed both their vanity and their desperation. For to them the bedchamber was not only a place of service, but a shortcut, a ladder by which they might climb past the great lords who had for years dominated the court, and in William they saw not a loyal servant, but a rival whose removal could clear their way to the king's side. So it was that as the sun rose higher, and the first summons for water and linen came from within the bedchamber, the tension in the corridor had thickened like the air before a storm, and William, moving with practiced grace, admitted those permitted by custom and the king's favor, while noting keenly the narrowed eyes, the clenched jaws, the exchanged glances. Among those left waiting, for he understood that exclusion today might mean vengeance tomorrow. And though his hands poured water for Henry's morning wash with calm precision, his thoughts ran ahead to what might follow, the traps that might be laid, the whispers that might seek to poison the king's mind against him. Yet William's resolve hardened with every breath, for he knew that the privilege of the bedchamber was not merely granted but defended through vigilance, through humility that veiled strength, through a loyalty so steady that even the most venomous rumor could not dislodge it. And as Henry laughed at a jest William murmured to lighten his morning, William told himself that whatever dangers the day might bring, he would stand as guardian not only of the king's chamber, but of his own hard-won place in the perilous theatre of Tudor power. The corridors of Whitehall breathed with a silence that felt less like calm and more like the still pause before the storm. And William, walking with measured steps as dawn broke pale and thin across the Thames, felt the full weight of the shifting tides of power, for he knew that the bedchamber was no longer a sanctuary, but a battlefield, and those who wished to claim it were sharpening their weapons, not of steel, but of whispers, alliances, and deceit. When he entered the king's chamber that morning, he found Henry in one of his unpredictable humors, his leg aching so badly that the air was thick with the scent of ointments and vinegar, and every movement drew a growl of frustration. And yet beneath that visible rage there was a gleam in the king's eyes, the gleam of a man who knew he could still command loyalty and fear with the tilt of his voice, and William realized that, while the king weakened, the throne itself remained a furnace in which rivalries were forged hotter than ever. Already the signs were present. For the courtiers who once smiled too readily at William now offered him only guarded nods, and behind those nods were whispers that he was becoming too close, too necessary, too dangerous, for the intimacy of the king's bed was a kind of leash, and whoever held it could tug the crown in directions unseen by the public but felt by every ambitious man at court. Later that day, as William carried the velvet pillow upon which the king's nightcap had rested to be cleaned, he overheard Sir Edmund, an older courtier, who had long hovered at the edges of influence, saying in low tones to Lord Brereton that the king ought to be reminded of how dangerous it was to trust a single servant too deeply, and William, though pretending not to hear, understood perfectly that the arrows were now aimed at his back, the whispers planted like seeds in Henry's already suspicious mind. And yet William was no fool, for he had known from the moment he first stepped into the chamber that his rise would attract envy as surely as the sun drew shadows, and though the threat pressed close, there was also in him a growing steel, a resolve to hold steady even as the tides turned rough, for he remembered his father's quiet advice, spoken years before in a thatched hall in Kent. Those who stand nearest to the fire must either learn its language or be burned away. That night, when the chamber was cleared and Henry's breathing finally slowed into uneasy sleep, William stood by the flickering candles staring at the heavy tapestries that hid the stone walls, and he whispered to himself that he would not surrender this place easily. Not to Edmund nor Brereton nor any man who sought to unseat him for the king's trust. Once won, was not so easily broken, and though he might falter, William knew that he would fight for his place with silence, with discretion, and with the subtle weapons of loyalty sharper than any dagger. And so William poised like a man standing on the edge of a knife, for he held both the most precious trust and the most perilous target in all of England, and as the shadows of the bedchamber thickened, the war for the king's intimacy had only just begun. The night's bitter silence gave way to a dawn that came not gently but with a strange urgency. For the bells of the palace chapel rang earlier than custom, and the corridors filled with a hurried murmur of servants, who carried no trays of bread or pitchers of ale, but instead scraps of rumour wrapped in their hurried steps. And William, already half-dressed from an uneasy sleep, felt as though the sound of those bells were tolling for a truth he had long expected yet dreaded to confront, for they bore the weight of change. He pulled on his doublet with trembling fingers, not for the chill but for the sense that his place, the fragile fabric of his standing within the king's bedchamber, was about to be tested in ways that no loyalty nor watchful eye could fully shield against. For when rival courtiers moved in shadows, it was often dawn that revealed the first stroke of their designs. And as William hurried along the passage that smelled faintly of smoke from last night's torches, he felt how every eye that glanced upon him carried not simple recognition but measurement, as if the household itself was deciding where he stood in the game now quickening around the king's bed. When he entered the bedchamber antechamber, he found it already crowded in unusual fashion, for men who rarely came before the king was roused now clustered in little knots, whispering behind sleeves, their eyes darting toward the heavy curtains that shielded the royal bed. And among them William saw Sir Edmund and Lord Suffolk, exchanging words too quietly to be innocent, their faces lit with the pale fire of ambition that needed no torch to be seen. And it struck William then that the battle he had feared had at last crossed the threshold. He stepped forward with purpose, his hand at his side as though steadying the dagger that lay hidden beneath his coat, though in truth no steel could serve him here, for the weapons of this contest were not blades but whispers, favors, secrets, and the subtle drip of influence that could drown even the most steadfast servant. And as he crossed the chamber to take his place near the royal curtains, he felt the air shift with the unspoken knowledge that soon the king himself would awaken to the day, and with his rising, alliances might fall or flourish in a single glance or word. The chamberlain, grave-faced and stiff, appeared with a parchment in hand, announcing that the king had commanded the attendance of only 3 men within the bedchamber that morning: William, Sir Edmund, and Suffolk. a choice that made the others bristle with thinly veiled frustration, for to be excluded from such intimacy was to be diminished. And William, though accustomed to the closeness of his duties, now felt how dangerous that intimacy could become when shared with rivals whose designs upon the king's trust were sharpened by envy. As the curtains were drawn back and the pale light of dawn brushed the king's weary face, William caught sight of the sovereign not as the figure of majesty he bore to the court, but as a man troubled by the weight of years and choices, his eyes heavy yet quick to search the faces gathered near. And when those eyes fell upon William, he thought he glimpsed a flicker of reassurance, as though the king still trusted his presence. Yet the moment was fleeting, interrupted by Edmund's smooth voice offering news of a petition from the north that required urgent decision, and by Suffolk's bowing suggestion that perhaps certain privileges of the bedchamber should be reconsidered for the sake of efficiency. William listened in silence, his heart hammering, for he heard not only the words spoken but the intent that lay beneath. Edmund sought to burden the king with matters beyond the bed to show himself indispensable in governance, while Suffolk sought to redefine the very structure of the chamber, to prune away those he deemed unnecessary, and William knew well that in Suffolk's pruning shears his own name was among the first to be cut. When the king waved away Edmund's petition with a weary hand and muttered that the chamber was not to be turned into a council hall, William felt a faint relief, but Suffolk pressed still, suggesting that too many minor attendants crowded the chamber and that the king's rest might be better guarded by fewer, more trusted men. And at that word, trusted, William's blood ran cold, for trust was the currency of their world, and to cast doubt on one man's trust was to lay the first stone in his ruin. Gathering his breath, William stepped forward, his voice calm though inside he burned with the knowledge that his silence would be taken for weakness, and he spoke not in defense of himself alone but of the chamber, as it had always been a place where the king's body and soul were safeguarded, not by ambition, but by familiarity, loyalty, and constancy. And he dared to remind the king gently, yet firmly, that those who shared the most private hours of his life were not to be chosen by calculation of power, but by the quiet measure of devotion proven over years. The king looked at him then long and steady, as though weighing not merely his words, but his essence, and for a moment the chamber held its breath with Suffolk's lips pressed thin in concealed frustration and Edmund's eyes shifting like a man gauging which way the tide was turning. And William knew that whatever the king's reply this moment would shape not just his own fate, but the course of the bedchamber itself, for in Tudor courts the difference between favor and disgrace was measured not in miles, but in inches, in whispers, in the narrow space between the curtains of the royal bed. The next days at court unfolded with a dangerous quiet that reminded William of the ominous stillness before a summer storm. For though the king continued to smile and jest in the sight of his courtiers, the air in the privy chamber was heavy with unseen rivalries, with whispered promises traded in corridors and sly glances shared across the tables at mealtime, each man measuring how much closer he could move to the king's bedchamber without drawing suspicion, and each aware that one wrong step could cast him out into disgrace forever. William, though still secure in the king's nightly summons, now felt the shadow of danger pressing heavier with every hour. For the rivals who had so far been content to mutter in the hall now began to move with boldness, sending their allies to linger near the bedchamber door on some invented errand, hoping to catch a moment's familiarity with the king, while others whispered slyly to foreign ambassadors, offering hints that the man most trusted to guard the king's sleep might not remain unshaken for long if certain tongues were loosened. In one such dawn, when William had barely finished the quiet business of setting the king's chamber in order before the first councillors knocked, he overheard a hushed conversation in the corridor beyond, voices low but edged with intent, speaking of how the favor granted to a single man could make others envious enough to invent sins where none existed. And William knew at once these words were not idle but aimed at him. For who else so recently had risen so high from obscurity to intimacy, without a bloodline to protect him? That same morning the king, perhaps sensing the tension, or perhaps simply weary of the endless grasping hands of his nobles, turned to William as he helped him dress and said in a tone both weary and sharp, "You know, my friend, these men would sell their honor for a place beside my bed. Yet I trust fewer with my secrets than I trust you. Words that should have comforted him, but instead weighed heavier, for such trust only painted his back with a larger target. In the council chamber later that day, the rivals moved with subtle coordination, steering conversations toward the dangers of false intimacy, of how too much power in the privy chamber might corrupt the flow of honest counsel. And though no name was spoken, all eyes slid toward William when the words hung in the air, and he, standing silent near the back as befitted one of his station, felt the heat of their suspicion like fire on his skin. When night fell again and William once more guided the king into rest, his mind was not quieted by the routine of preparing the bedchamber, for he now knew that the struggle for control of that sacred space was no longer hidden, but had begun in earnest, and every gesture, every word, and every silence could tilt the balance of his survival. And so he lay awake on his pallet near the door, listening not to the king's breathing alone, but to the muffled movements beyond. 2 footsteps that lingered too long outside the chamber, 2 whispers quickly silenced when he stirred, to the unmistakable signs that the storm had broken, and that the rivals who had once envied his nearness now sought actively to unseat him, even if it meant the ruin of all. The night air lay heavy over Whitehall Palace, and William found himself walking slowly beneath the flickering torches of the galleries, his mind still burning with the echoes of the chamber and the whispered words of men who had drawn closer to the king's bed than they had any right to. And he felt the weight of his oath pressing more keenly upon his shoulders than ever before, for he had come to see that to guard the royal bed was not merely to attend to a man's sleep, but to defend the entire realm from those who believed intimacy was power, and that power, once grasped, could be bent to their own hungers. He paused near the privy stairs, hearing the faintest shuffle in the shadows, and though his hand instinctively moved toward the dagger at his belt, he stilled it, listening harder until the figure of young Thomas, one of the lesser servants, merged his face, pale, his eyes darting like a rabbit caught between torchlight and fox. And William, seeing the lad's trembling lips, drew him gently aside and demanded to know why he crept so close to the royal chambers at so late an hour. And Thomas stammered of overheard voices, voices of lords whose names he dared not repeat aloud, speaking of locks and keys, and of which of the king's companions might be made pliant with coin or threat. William sent him away with a stern command never to linger near such places again, but inside his chest his heart hammered. For if even the lowliest servant heard such words, then the scheme was deeper than mere tavern mutterings. It was a net spreading through corridors and kitchens, a web in which the king's very person was the prize, and William understood that to falter now would be to surrender his master to the ambitions of wolves clothed in velvet. The following morning broke cold with a mist rising off the Thames and curling about the palace walls like ghostly fingers. And as William readied the king for his appearance before council, adjusting the jeweled chain upon his shoulders and smoothing the folds of his robe, he could not help but mark the shadows beneath the sovereign's eyes, shadows carved not by poor sleep alone, but by the weight of endless supplication, of knowing that every man who bowed before him had already calculated how to turn favor into fortune, and that even within the chamber, even in the hour before dawn, there might be no rest from those who desired to command his ear. At council that day, the murmurs William had feared began to crystallize, for he saw the glance exchanged between Norfolk and Suffolk, sharp as blades drawn beneath the table, and he heard the careful phrasing of Cromwell as he spoke of reforms that would alter who was permitted access to the royal lodgings. Reforms that seemed on their surface about efficiency, but carried within them the seeds of displacement for to redraw. The lines of chamber duty was to topple the hierarchy William himself had fought to uphold, and to place strangers where once loyalty had been the shield. As the voices rose and fell, William kept his place at the edge, unseen yet seeing all, and he realized that the real battlefield of Tudor power was not the chamber itself, but the struggle over its door. The ceaseless war to decide who held the key, and he knew that the days ahead would demand from him a vigilance more unyielding than ever, for the very breath of the king was now entangled with the ambitions of men who would risk the ruin of England, if it meant the triumph of their faction. That evening, when the king retired, William lit the candles himself and stood long at the foot of the bed, watching as Henry's vast frame sank into slumber. the rise and fall of his chest slow and laborious, and William swore silently that so long as he drew breath, no rival's scheme nor whispered plot would breach this sanctuary, for the bedchamber was more than a place of rest, it was the heart of the realm, and if that heart were ever pierced, all England would bleed. The winter of that year settled with a severity that seemed to press its weight not only upon the stones of the palace, but upon the hearts of all who lived within it. And for William the frost upon the ground was nothing compared to the frost of suspicion that crept between courtiers. For each man who smiled in the corridors and bowed low in the presence chamber might very well be the same man who whispered behind closed doors about the supposed frailties or indiscretions of another, and William, who had once thought his steady attendance in the king's bedchamber would shield him from the reach of such petty rivalries, now understood with a deep and sobering clarity that it was this very nearness to the king's body and soul that painted him in the colors of envy for others. He had spent the better part of that week watching with careful, almost obsessive attention the subtle gestures exchanged among those who desired his place, for he had begun to notice how a hand resting too long upon the king's chair, a casual remark about who rose earliest to tend his majesty, or even the slight arrangement of cushions at the bed's head could be transformed into tokens of loyalty when repeated by a tongue eager to curry favor, and these gestures, though outwardly insignificant, threatened to unseat him by degrees, as a stream carves stone, not by violence but by persistence. Late one evening, when the king had fallen into one of his rare but mercifully deep slumbers, William lingered near the window of the privy chamber, staring out at the pale moonlight stretched across the frozen gardens, and as he stood he overheard the muffled words of two gentlemen-at-arms in the corridor beyond, their voices pitched low but not low enough to escape the stillness of night. And what they spoke of chilled him more than the winter air, for they speculated not about tournaments or music, but about who might soon fall from grace, and whether it would be the quiet servant who stood always at the king's bedfoot, the one who had too much of his majesty's ear, and whether his enemies were gathering proof of some invented negligence to cast him down. From that moment William's nights grew longer and his days more burdened, for every time he poured the king's wine or fetched his robe he wondered whose eyes followed him with malice. And though he remained steady in service, ensuring the king's chamber was ever warm, the bed ever smooth, the chamber pot ever discreetly emptied, he felt that invisible daggers hovered behind his back, ready to strike with the smallest misstep. Yet amidst this storm of unease he found strength in the king's manner, for Henry, though mercurial and prone to bursts of both affection and fury, often turned to William with the kind of familiarity one reserves for a trusted brother, asking him for his quiet thoughts on the day's business, or allowing him to share in the small, almost tender routines that no nobleman would ever imagine the mighty king capable of, such as humming a half-forgotten hymn before sleep, or demanding the same blanket he had favored as a boy. And in those moments William remembered why he endured the envy of others, for he alone was present to witness the sovereign as a man. But as January waned and the feasts for Twelfth Night faded, the plotting of rivals no longer remained in whispers, for an incident unfolded that thrust suspicion into the open. One morning when the king awoke later than his habit, it was discovered that a private letter sealed with his own hand had gone missing from the coffer near his bedside. And though the king roared in anger at the negligence, it was William whose position placed him nearest the blame. For who else had been tasked with guarding the sanctity of that space, if not the groom of the stool himself? The chamber that had once been William's sanctuary now transformed into a courtroom of unspoken accusation, and the lords who had long envied his closeness seized the moment with subtle glee, raising brows, murmuring about carelessness, suggesting in roundabout ways that perhaps new blood was needed in such a trusted post. And though William defended his honor with calm words and a steady gaze, he knew his hold upon the king's trust now hung by the thinnest of threads. That night, alone in the bedchamber after Henry had retired in restless silence, William stood with his hand upon the great bedpost and whispered to himself that he must find who had dared breach the sanctity of the king's private world, for only by unmasking the true culprit could he preserve both his service and his very life. And so he resolved that in the days to come he would watch not only the king's slumber but the steps of every man who sought entrance, for in the world of Tudor courts the greatest danger was not found in the battlefield's roar but in the quiet theft of a sealed letter from a sleeping king. William awoke the next morning to the sound of muffled footsteps pacing outside his chamber door, the kind of restless motion that spoke of unease rather than duty, and when he dressed and stepped out, he found Sir Edward waiting with a pale expression, his cloak clasped too tightly about him, as though he wished to hide within it, and the man bowed low, but his words spilled out almost without breath as he reported that the rival courtiers who had been whispering in the lesser galleries the night before had gathered boldly in the southern wing, drawing with them a knot of servants and petitioners, and were even now crafting a letter they claimed would go straight to the king to denounce William's influence, his loyalty, and his supposed ambition to keep the royal bedchamber under his private command. William felt the weight of this news settle over him like iron chains, for he had known it would come eventually, but he had hoped for more time, perhaps another day, perhaps even a week, and yet now he was forced to reckon with the reality that his adversaries had moved swiftly, sensing the king's temporary fever and distraction as an opening to press their case. And though anger rose in him, he mastered it with a deep breath, asking Edward what men were present, what alliances had been struck, and most of all whether the king's secretaries had been drawn into this plot for William. Understood that the pen of a secretary often wielded more danger than the sword of a guard. Edward confessed that one of the younger scribes had indeed been seen in the southern wing, carrying a bundle of parchment and ink, and though the boy looked nervous, he had remained at the table where the rivals spoke, no doubt copying their words into some form of letter, and William clenched his jaw, knowing that once ink was laid to paper, the shadow of accusation gained a permanence that rumor alone could not match. For the written word, even when false, could become a weapon sharp enough to cut a man's place from under him. As he moved down the hall, the echo of his boots striking against the stone in steady rhythm, William's thoughts ran faster than his steps, and he recalled with painful clarity the old tales told by chamberlains who had served kings long gone, how those who once enjoyed the intimacy of the bedchamber often became the most resented, how they were accused of whispering in the monarch's ear by night, guiding policy by stealth and reaping favor in silence, and though William knew his loyalty was unbroken, he could already hear how his enemies would twist his vigil by the king's bedside into something darker, how they would claim he sought to rule while the king slept, how they would paint him not as a servant but as a master in disguise. When he reached the king's chamber, he found the monarch still resting, though his color had improved slightly, and William stood for a long moment in the dim candlelight, torn between the duty to remain by the bed and the urgent need to confront the schemes unfolding beyond those walls. And finally, he resolved that loyalty required not only attendance, but defense, that he must act to preserve his station, lest the very trust the king had placed in him be used as evidence of treachery. He sent Edward to fetch Thomas, the steward, and together the three men convened in a quiet alcove by the window where the morning sun bled pale light through the glass. And there William spoke plainly, telling them that their enemies had begun to act with boldness, that a letter was already in draft, and that unless they countered swiftly, the king would awaken not to the comfort of loyal service, but to the venom of slander placed in his hand under the guise of counsel. And Thomas, who had weathered the politics of court longer than either of them, nodded grimly and said that the first move must not be defense but offense, that they must seize the ground before the ink of their rivals dried. Thus William began to plot his response, not with sword or open challenge, but with the same tools his adversaries used: words, alliances, and the careful weaving of truth into a net that could entangle lies. And as he spoke, his resolve hardened, for he realized that if the king's bedchamber was indeed the fulcrum upon which power in the realm balanced, then he could not afford to yield an inch, for once driven from that chamber he would not only lose favor, but perhaps his freedom, perhaps even his life. And so as the sun rose higher and the corridors filled with the hum of voices, William prepared to step back into the storm of intrigue. his mind sharpened by the knowledge that the next hours might decide everything, whether he remained the trusted guardian of the king's most private realm, or whether he became another discarded name in the long and dangerous history of those who had once dared to keep the king's trust too closely. The morning after the tense supper in the king's private chamber dawned with the kind of pale stillness that seemed more like a breath being held than the arrival of a new day. And William, rising from his narrow bed in the small chamber allotted to him off the privy gallery, felt that same stillness weighing upon him, for he knew that in the whispers which had curled like smoke around the dinner table, in the measured glances traded between Norfolk and Suffolk, and in the subtle tightening of the king's jaw when certain names were spoken, the future of his position and perhaps his very survival had been set upon a knife's edge. So that when he dressed himself in his plain doublet and smoothed his hair, every movement was tinged with the awareness that by nightfall the court might be rearranged like pieces upon a chessboard, and the loyal page who had once been invisible might suddenly find himself a pawn targeted for removal. He went about his early duties with meticulous care, adjusting the hangings near the king's bed so they fell without wrinkle, ensuring the coals in the brazier were neither too hot nor too dim, and laying out the king's morning shirt of fine Holland linen, but all the while his ears strained for the sounds beyond the chamber, for he knew that rivals among the courtiers, those who coveted not only the bedchamber posts, but the influence that came with the king's ear, in unguarded moments were already scheming with sharpened tongues, and he feared that today their whispers would grow louder, solidifying into petitions, accusations, or worse, into the sort of insinuations that Henry, in his mercurial temper, might seize upon and use as justification to reshuffle his household. When at last the king stirred and William moved forward to assist him, he noticed at once a heaviness in Henry's demeanor, as though the king too had not slept soundly, for his eyes were shadowed and his hand, when it waved William closer, trembled just faintly. Yet there was in his tone a sharpness when he asked whether Norfolk had passed by in the gallery, as though he were measuring the air for signs of disloyalty, and William Boeing reported truthfully that he had seen no one, though in his heart he wondered whether spies had already passed unseen by him, leaving behind trails of intrigue, invisible yet deadly. By mid-morning the atmosphere within the privy lodgings had shifted palpably. Courtiers entering and leaving the galleries with the careful gait of men rehearsing neutrality while their minds churned with plots, and William, stationed near the door as the king received several visitors, observed in silence the subtle war being waged through gestures. A bow held a second too long, a glance darted toward the tapestry where others might hide behind, a cough designed to interrupt at a strategic moment all the theater of rivalry made manifest, and William realized that if yesterday had been the overture, today was the first act of a dangerous play in which the prize was not merely influence but survival itself. As noon approached, word began to ripple through the court that a petition had been prepared, one said to question the loyalty of certain officers of the bedchamber, and though no names were spoken aloud within William's hearing, the furtive looks cast in his direction, and the way conversations stilled when he entered a room, told him that he was entangled in it, whether directly accused or simply caught in the web, for in the court's cruel arithmetic, suspicion once attached was seldom removed without cost. Yet William, though inwardly shaken, steadied himself by recalling the king's occasional words of favor, the rare but unmistakable gestures of trust. How Henry had once spoken to him in the twilight before sleep of fears he would never have confessed before the lords, how he had entrusted him with letters too delicate for others to carry, and how, only yesterday, despite the presence of great dukes, the king had addressed him with that tone of habitual reliance that bespoke more than mere convenience. And William resolved then that, if danger must come, he would meet it not by shrinking but by walking straight into it, for he knew that invisibility could no longer be his armor. Instead, his survival would rest upon loyalty proven so visibly that even the king's volatile heart could not doubt it. Thus, as the sun climbed higher and the bells marked the hours, William made his way toward the council chamber, where Norfolk, Suffolk, and several others were gathered before entering the king's presence, and though his legs trembled, he kept his step, even bowing with calm dignity as he passed, and he saw in the flicker of Norfolk's eyes, a recognition that the page who once carried basins and towels without notice now stood as a player in the game, and that recognition, though dangerous, gave William a strange, quiet strength. Inside the king's chamber, the storm broke at last, with Norfolk presenting his careful words about the need for greater vigilance among those who attended the king at his most private hours. His tone smooth yet edged with accusation, and Suffolk murmuring agreement, while the king, seated in his chair with his great hands gripping the arms, listened in heavy silence, his gaze shifting at intervals toward William, who stood near the door with lowered eyes but ears keenly alert. And in that moment William felt as though the entire court balanced upon the fulcrum of Henry's temper, which might swing toward wrath or favor in the blink of an eye. When the king finally spoke, his words were slow and deliberate, and though he acknowledged the necessity of loyalty and vigilance, he added that he himself would judge who was worthy of his trust, for none but he could know the measure of a man's service in the bedchamber. And as he said this, his eyes fixed directly upon William, who felt the weight of that gaze like a brand upon his soul, and though he dared not lift his head fully, he knew that for this day at least, the king had signaled his defense, leaving Norfolk and Suffolk to mask their disappointment behind courtly bows. But William also knew that this reprieve was no end to the danger, for men as powerful as Norfolk and Suffolk did not relinquish ambition with a single rebuke, and as he withdrew with the others he resolved that if their schemes were to grow sharper, then his vigilance must grow sharper still, and his loyalty must not only be real but seen to be real, displayed in every action, every word, so that none might doubt that he was the king's creature entirely. For in such times survival depended not on hiding, but on being unassailable in the one virtue the king valued most, unswerving devotion. The court stirred restlessly in those uneasy days as whispers ran along the carved wooden galleries and echoed beneath the painted ceilings, whispers that told of rivalries sharpening like knives in the velvet shadows of the king's private apartments. For each man who coveted nearness to the royal bed believed that with the right moment of intimacy, he might sway the course of kingdoms, and with that belief came schemes spun quietly over goblets of wine. Schemes that spread like smoke until they began to take shape in alliances sealed by nods and knowing glances in the great hall. William, steady in his outward bearing though restless in his heart, saw how men once courteous now carried in their eyes the glimmer of suspicion, and how gentlemen of the chamber watched one another not merely as colleagues bound to serve the king, but as rivals, poised to pounce on any faltering step that might grant them a foothold closer to his majesty as pillow. For in that sacred space of the bedchamber, where secrets were spoken in hushed tones and confidences exchanged with drowsy candor, lay the very soul of influence at court. On a morning when the autumn light streamed golden through the latticed windows, William crossed the long gallery toward his duties. And though his tread was measured and his expression calm, his thoughts churned with the memory of words left unspoken, for the night before the king had lingered in reflection upon the disloyalty of courtiers long gone, hinting that perhaps treachery was not confined to the past, but might already creep among those who now bowed so deeply, and those hints had lain heavy on William's mind as he bent to his tasks with a newfound gravity. That very morning, as he adjusted the drapery beside the royal bed, he overheard faintly the measured voices of two courtiers in the adjoining room, their tones polite yet edged with steel, for they spoke not of the affairs of state nor of the splendors of the hunt, but of who had lately lingered longest by the king's side at night, and who had whispered counsel that seemed to weigh upon his majesty's heart. And William knew in that moment that the contest for the king's chamber was no idle rivalry, but a contest that might shape the rise or ruin of men of noble blood. The king himself, though burdened by the crown and the cares of Europe's watchful gaze, seemed at times almost childlike in his need for trust, and William, beholding him in unguarded moments when he reached for warmth more than counsel, felt the paradox of power laid bare. For the man upon whom a kingdom leaned was yet vulnerable in his solitude, and it was in that solitude that the ambitious pressed harder, seeking to clothe their desires in the garments of loyalty. As the day wore on, and William attended to the smaller rituals of service, he could not shake the sense that his every gesture was watched not only by the king but by the circling hawks who measured his closeness with envious eyes, and he understood that his place, once a sanctuary of honor, had become a target. Upon his back, for to be near the royal bed was to be near both power and peril, and in that truth lay the beginning of dangers he had scarcely yet imagined. That night, as the chamber was hushed and the king sank into the soft folds of sleep, William stood in his accustomed vigil, yet his ears were attuned not only to the king's breathing, but to the muted footsteps. Beyond the door, footsteps of men who pretended to walk idly in the gallery yet lingered, as if waiting for opportunity, and William realized with cold certainty that he had crossed a threshold, for no longer was he merely a servant of trust, but a man enmeshed in a contest that might consume his honor, his safety, and perhaps even his life. The corridors of Whitehall lay cloaked in the hushed silence of a winter's eve, the only sounds the muffled hiss of wind against the stone and the occasional creak of old timbers, and William, now seasoned by years of service within the most secret chambers of the king, felt the weight of time pressing upon him as he realized that the intrigues which had once seemed like distant whispers had swollen into storms that now raged with full force just beyond the bedchamber's guarded threshold. For the rivals who had plotted and schemed with clever words and hidden hands had grown desperate, and in their desperation they turned their gaze fully upon the one who remained ever closest to the sovereign, William himself. It was whispered that papers had vanished from the privy coffer, that letters bearing the king's own seal had found their way into the hands of those who should never have touched them, and though William knew he had locked and secured every chest, the fact remained that someone moved in shadow, eager to place blame, eager to topple him from his post and claim that nearness to the royal bed that meant both peril and power. And as he paced within his small chamber, the flicker of candlelight catching the lines that worry had carved into his brow, he could not help but think of all those who had once stood where he stood, men whose names were now carved upon traitors' scaffolds or whispered as warnings to new courtiers who thought proximity meant security. The morning that followed brought no peace, for the king awoke in foul humor, his body racked by pain and his temper set ablaze by it. And in such moments the smallest misstep, a misplaced robe, a sluggish hand in drawing back curtains, a wrong word spoken might become the spark that lit the fury of Henry himself. And so William moved with the quiet precision of one who had long learned that, in tending to the body of the king, he must also soothe the torments of his mind, offering comfort without intrusion, deference without weakness, presence without presumption. But as he labored in silence, he felt the eyes of the rivals lingering just beyond the door, waiting, watching, ready to seize upon the faintest falter. By noon the whispers had turned to accusations, spoken not yet in open council but in the private chambers of men with ambition burning hotter than loyalty, men who claimed that William had grown too bold, that he thought himself the guardian not just of the king's bed, but of the king's very will, that he had denied access to those who should rightfully advise the monarch. And though William knew it was false, he also knew that in the Tudor court, truth was often the least valued coin, for perception, rumor, and envy outweighed fact, and the crown itself could turn upon the winds of suspicion. Yet even as the storm gathered, William's resolve hardened like iron, for he understood that to falter now would be to invite ruin, and so he carried himself through that long day with the calm of one who knew his role, drawing the curtains at dusk, laying the royal head upon its pillows, and whispering words of reassurance that the sovereign's rest would be guarded, not only by locked doors and steel blades, but by the unwavering loyalty of a servant who had walked the narrowest path of survival for years and who now faced the greatest test of all, the test of standing firm as rivals reached for daggers sharpened not of steel, but of rumor, treachery, and ambition. And as night fell again over the palace, William sat alone in the flickering glow of the dying fire, his heart steady despite the shadows pressing in. For he knew that, though tomorrow might bring the breaking point, exposure, dismissal, or worse it, might also reveal the depth of the king's trust in him, and in that trust lay the thin but vital thread upon which his fate and perhaps the very balance of the court now hung. Trembling, in the breathless pause before the storm would finally break, And so the tale wound to its quiet end as William, once merely a cautious observer of bedchamber privilege, stood at the window of Whitehall and looked out over the Thames in the pale light of dawn, reflecting on all that he had witnessed, the scheming, the betrayals, the whispered promises, traded in the shadows of the king's chamber, and the heavy truth that proximity to power was both the sweetest prize and the deadliest trap in Tudor England. And as the bells of the chapel began to toll for morning mass, he felt the weight of his own survival settle upon his shoulders. For, unlike those who had clawed their way to the king's bedside only to be cast aside in disgrace or dragged to the Tower in chains, William had learned to bend, to watch, and to endure. And in that endurance he discovered that the true secret of the bedchamber was not in its gilded tapestries or its perfumed cushions, but in the fragile trust that bound king and servant, a trust that could lift a man to glory or dash him against the stones of ruin with but a single sigh from the monarch's lips. And as the sun broke fully over the river, flooding the court with golden light, William knew that the story of royal intimacy, of who dressed the king, who guarded his slumber, and who whispered in his ear in the quiet hours of night, would go on long after his own footsteps faded from these halls. And perhaps one day, he thought with a faint smile, another courtier would stand where he stood now, gazing out across the Thames, wondering as he did whether the privileges of the bedchamber were blessings or curses, but knowing beyond doubt that they were never truly safe. And with that final thought he turned from the window, his figure slipping silently back into the chambers where history was written not with ink upon parchment, but with glances, whispers, and the shifting breath of kings. And thus the story of Tudor bedroom privilege passed at last into memory, leaving us to wonder at the fragile dance of trust and betrayal that defined an age. And so, dear listener, our journey drifts to a gentle close, the last candle flickering low as history settles into silence once more. And if sleep has not already claimed you, then may it find you now, quietly, softly, as the echoes of the past fade into dreams. And before we part, I would ask, if you found comfort in tonight's wandering tale, to let your kindness ripple outward with a simple touch of a button, to subscribe, to like, and to share, so that this little corner of history may continue to reach others who long for rest, for calm, for stories whispered through the long night. And if you wish to walk again through the forgotten halls and hidden chambers of the past, then return here whenever you wish, for there will always be another tale waiting, another night to be gently filled with history's voice. Until then, sleep well, dream deep, and know that you are always welcome back.